It's 50 minutes past 3 o'clock already, so could we perhaps please everyone find a seat so we can start this session, and we're going to start with a welcome address by the president of our Social Democratic group, Erickson. So I give you the floor first. Thank you for being here and thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you, Agnes, and thank you all of you to be here in this important event for our political family. As you know, we are in the beginning of the term, and we are trying to open important debates for us in our priorities, and that is one of the most important issues for us, for the social democracy, and I want to thank your presence here because your presence is a clear commitment to work together with us in a different levels, of course, aspects. As I can explain in the beginning of the term, for us the cooperation with the trade unions is very important, and for that I want to say thank you for to be here, and we will open very interesting debate with common goals for us as a social democrat, as a trade unions, as a civil society in Europe. En primer lugar, me gustaría, por supuesto.
So first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking Agnes from the Employment Committee and Helen, Vice President of the Bureau for Social and Employment Matters. So thank you for this initiative. Now, and I think this is really the right time for an event of this kind, at the start of a new legislative term with a new commission and a new parliament. So we have to really make the most of this opportunity and the special circumstances that we find ourselves in now to really push forward on this issue. And I'd like to take this opportunity of my opening speech to say to the trade unions who are participating in this event, Luca Vicentini and Oliver Röpke, I'd like to thank you for your participation today, because really it's, only through cooperation that we will be successful in getting our values through as social democrats and as European trade union movements. It's absolutely crucial that all Europeans are able to access a fair wage, a decent wage. So we're going to hear about poverty in work, poor workers, and there's a new class that's emerging of workers who are in poverty. So we're not only seeing exclusion as a risk to people who are out of work, it's also a risk that people in work are facing increasingly, people who don't have access to decent wages. So we need to work to keep our political family united, even though there may be different stances, different positions. Ultimately, we share one common goal. We want to improve the quality of living for Europeans, protect decent jobs. So let's come together around the issues that we share. One of the key issues in the European in the campaign for the European election was actually around this issue, and it's a debate that we've really launched in the current Commission, and that we've really actually stolen this debate away from Ms. von der Leyen in the first big plenary debate when she was presenting the Commission's priorities. She included this as one of the priorities, and that's very largely thanks to the pressure that we'd been exerting as Socialists and Democrats. There's no coincidence here. It's no coincidence that within the European Commission's framework we've got Nicolas Schmidt in charge of this very important issue of employment and social rights. Let's remember that the original portfolio title referred only to employment, and it's thanks to us that the social dimension, the wider social dimension, was added to the title. We can't really talk about creating more jobs if that doesn't come hand in hand with better protection of workers' rights. So it's no coincidence, as I said, that we have someone very committed in the Commission in charge of this policy area. You know, it's really with great pride that I see Nicolas here working on this. I'm very, very proud to see you there. And it's just a year ago I was saying we will fight to defend decent wages across Europe. Poverty in work is morally unjustifiable, and trade union activism is effective as a way to push up wages. We need to stress our importance of the social pillar, which under Art 6 talks about decent wages. All workers have a right to a fair wage that grants them a dignified existence and life. Salaries need to be established in a transparent and predictable way, in line with national practices and respecting the autonomy of social partners. Now, we need, therefore, to respect the national systems that are working. However, this shouldn't mean that we're not doing everything within our means at European level to improve the lives of all these workers. It's our responsibility and duty to ensure that we can make sure that traditional wage bargaining systems are able to yield better results, and that we can get those better results in those countries where the systems are absent. Poverty in work is on the rise, and that's unacceptable. We've seen 8% in 2010 going up in significantly just 2 years later. So we've got some 20 million at risk of falling into poverty, despite the fact that they're in work. We're talking here about something structural. It's about more than just a law on minimum wages. Of course that's necessary, but we need stronger cooperation. We need more robust contracts, employment contracts, cut out 0 hours contracts, take out intermediaries in the labour market who simply cream off the workers' salaries, and make employment relations and worker relations more democratic and transparent. Now, we can see that the world of work is changing, and it's changing fast, but we can't accept precarious working conditions as some kind of new normal. The European Commission had a very clear message, and we simply can't afford to fail. We can perhaps afford to make mistakes, but we cannot afford to simply not try. It's our duty vis-à-vis society. We must try and strive for change. It's going to be tough, it's going to be hard, but as socialists and democrats, we simply can't turn our back on all these problems. So what divides us? When it comes to the respect for collective bargaining, there's a consultation that was launched in Europe with a roadmap for a social Europe, and it clearly states that no European action within the field of minimum wages will seek harmonization of minimum wages in the European Union, and the national traditions will have to be respected, the autonomy of social partners and the freedom of collective bargaining will be respected. Now, certain colleagues within the group have raised concerns. Colleagues who come from countries where there's a strongly rooted tradition of collective bargaining, all those concerns are valid and understandable. But I think we really need to step into each other's shoes and understand each other better. We need to understand where everyone's coming from with their worries and concerns. And we need to try and get out of any kind of impasse and confrontation that we may face. So we need to improve the systems in order to ensure that a legal minimum wage is established where there is no negotiated wage. We're not trying to just find a minimum common denominator. We're trying to bring up those the situations that the worst situations exist. We need to think about all those who are in a very difficult situations right now, who do not have a strong collective bargaining system to back their rights, and who do not therefore have access to fair wages. And I think it is perfectly compatible for us to try and strive for this, and we will do everything we can. let me say that a European minimum wage is one of the key tools and necessary tools when it comes to giving workers their dignity again. And there are, of course, other demands that we have expressed. It is just one of them. So we have come together today to have a very important debate. It's just the start. It's not the conclusion of this process. This is the starting gun, and we need to come together and do this work jointly. We have an important task in front of us, and we owe it to citizens. Citizens who expect more of Europe and who expect those in charge to achieve it on their behalf. And when you make commitments, when you make promises, you then move on to the phase where you have to move on to actions. So that's all I can say by way of introduction, and I apologize that I can't stay for the rest of the event because of other commitments in my diary. But I want to hand over to Helen and Agnes, who will be leading this seminar and discussion, and I of course welcome Nicholas Schmidt to our discussion here today, who will be making a very important statement too. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Erickson, for taking time in your busy schedule. I know you have to go, but it's much appreciated that you were here at the start of our meeting, because I think it's indeed clear that throughout Europe there are trends which affects lots of people at work. Already mentioned by Erickson, real wages are lagging behind. The coverage of collective agreements is slowly decreasing, and in-work poverty is on the rise, and that's not a picture where we should take pride in. Throughout Europe, we see indeed that the number of atypical jobs are growing. In my own country, the Netherlands, at this moment already 3 out of 8 people working are people working in flexible jobs, and that amount is growing instead of decreasing. Next to that, I think it's already clear that we used to work from the assumption that if the pie was growing, eventually everyone was getting a bigger part of the pie. That was the normal economic theory, trickling down notion, and that it was only a matter of time where East and West should move in the same upwards convergence direction. And I think in this moment of time, it's clear that if we don't do anything, inequality is rising. One of the instruments to address these issues is indeed the European minimum wage. I think progressive governments in, for instance, Portugal and Spain are guiding us the way in raising the minimum wage as a way of giving people a better and more decent living. And I'm for instance, myself totally convinced that if the wage level in Bulgaria is going to rise, all our labor markets are going to profit from that, because our labor markets are interlinked. And therefore, at the start of the debate, I'm very happy Nicholas is here. He's going to address us, and if we all behave very nicely, we also have some time for Q&A. But I think at the start of the debate, when we are clear what we want to reach, more equality, a better and fair working conditions for all workers in Europe, let's work on this proposal around the European minimum wage, and let's all support Nicholas as our commissioner in his support. So can I please ask him to take the floor and give his keynote, and then we have later on some time for Q&As. Nicholas.
Thank you very much. So I will start in French and then switch to English, because now we have to have linguistic diversity. So first, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Thank you also to Arache and Hélène. Thank you for inviting me, but above all, thank you for organizing this seminar. I think the presence here shows there's a great deal of interest in this idea of a minimum wage, and it's also the place where we need to discuss the salary or salaries, because I don't think we should reduce this to the minimum wage or salary alone. It's a general issue around it, including the minimum salary. So I think that is our DNA, to talk justice and to talk justice by means of pay. From 2016, moreover, our group has championed the idea of a common European basis of social rights, and I think this is principle number 6, that there should be this basic salary. And in principle 6, it clearly states that there are 2 ways on salaries, including minimum ones. Either collective bargaining, if that allows it, and if that's broad enough, or if that's not the case, which would be regrettable, it is setting a minimum wage, which is the statutory one, as we'd call it. Some today would ask why the rush to implement that. Well, that's because we take this foundation of minimum social rights seriously. We've always called for an action plan to implement that basic set of rights, and we are doing it by dint of this proposal on the minimum wage. Firstly, then, I think the idea that wages should be decent comes out. That's something that everyone should in fact share. Unfortunately, however, we see in Europe that around 10% of workers do not enjoy decent pay. They are affected by what we call in-work poverty. They're the working poor. Now, we cannot accept the idea that someone is working often 40 hours, sometimes less, not by choice but by obligation, not earning decent pay. The point has already been made. We must tackle this problem of the increasing lack of security suffered by workers, often in forms of work which are atypical and subject to very low pay. So then, firstly, it's an issue of social justice that we must fight poverty, but it goes beyond that. I think we must also look at the minimum wage issue in the economic context, and I'll say something about that. Defending decent wages in Europe also amounts to defending an economic approach. Now, you talked about automatic convergence, that labour markets would automatically come closer and pay too, and so also social conditions. But there's an example where markets haven't worked, namely between men and women. Now, you may say that markets will work very quickly to achieve man-woman pay equality, but has that happened? No, that has not happened. We are still in a situation where the pay gap between men and women on average, amounts to 16%. Therefore, markets do not automatically converge. If there are no rules or no action, one might end up waiting 50 years or 100 years. For women, it would have been more like 100 years plus for the gap to be reduced. You therefore need rules. If there wasn't a minimum wage in some countries, as we've seen, we would be at wage levels that do not allow decent living conditions. Labour markets theoretically should self-correct, but they don't, because they create very low pay levels, thus creating poverty effectively. So there's an economic argument as well, moreover, in terms of the brain drain. When young people from countries with extremely low wages see that their prospects in life are such that there's no reason for them to stick around, they make a choice, and that choice is to leave. We, the Commission, a few weeks ago travelled to Croatia, and the central point made by the Croats wasn't that the Commission should think about bringing in rules on the minimum wage. No, their main concern was the brain drain. A generation, successive generations leaving. 3 million Romanians have left the country. Not fundamentally different in Bulgaria either. 25% of people leaving have very high qualification levels. They're not on the minimum wage necessarily with high qualifications. Sometimes they are, because they often work in sectors where they're not much above the minimum wage. But there is another argument, which is that if the minimum wage is very low, so are salaries generally. There's a relationship between the minimum wage and wages in general. We don't just want to take action on the minimum wage. We hope that by raising the minimum wage, we will push the entire structure of pay upwards. Moreover, the best example is the poverty criterion, 60% of the average pay, as is well known. Now, an apparent paradox has it that the country closest to 60% is the one with the lowest minimum wage. What does that tell us? Well, it doesn't mean that people aren't poor on a minimum wage of 278 euros, but that pay in general is very low. There is therefore the need for an overall approach when you talk about minimum wages. It goes above and beyond the mere minimum. What are we proposing and why? Well, we are A, proposing that we fight poverty, of course, and B, that we think that you cannot forge a dynamic, innovative economy that invests in technological progress on the back of very low pay. There is therefore this economic argument which has clout. When pay is very low, businesses don't have much of an incentive to invest in innovation and new technological processes. The consequence of that, of course, is that the convergence gap, economic convergence, will be slowed down. You would have more economic convergence because of productivity. Economic convergence has to come through productivity, and vice versa too. So you don't want this big gap between countries that invest a great deal in innovation with higher wages and the rest. A third argument, as has been said, is that you cannot build an economic and social space with such big differentials. just to take the minimum wage, the ratio is something like 1 to 6 or 1 to 7. Is productivity marked by a similar 1 to 6 or 1 to 7 ratio? No, if you look at factors combined in Europe, it's 1 to 3. You can see, therefore, that there's an imbalance in some countries between the productivity level on one side and pay on the other. We, therefore, do need to reduce that pay differential to bring it closer to the productivity differential. Now, it's not all about a minimum wage in Europe. We've never called for that. We're realistic enough to realise that that won't happen in a very close future. What we must do, conversely, is to reduce the gap by putting in place instruments that can reduce the difference. If we're talking minimum wages, we must also talk about the other way of setting wages and salaries, which is collective bargaining. In the programme set out by President von der Leyen, she has stressed the idea of a social market economy greatly, and she's done that because it's already in the treaty. We've neglected it a bit, we've lost sight of it a bit. It's a social market economy. We've talked a lot about the market economy, but we've forgotten the social market economy. And in a social market economy, the best way of setting pay isn't necessarily a minimum wage. The minimum wage is second best, as we're often reminded. Option 2. Rather, a strong collective bargaining system is the best way. If we're speaking up for a minimum wage, we're championing, above all, a strong collective bargaining system. Now, our friends who have such a system will understand this all the better. I'm going to put it in English for that reason.
Minimum wage, I have already said that. Having fair, adequate wages and wages increases in a certain number of countries where they are low would, however, bring in a new dynamic. C'est ce que j'ai dit. Il faut qu'à travers le salaire minimum, on lève la structure générale des salaires. And I have been saying it continuously since the start of our mandate. The Commission is not seeking to undermine, destroy, or alter the collective bargaining system which exists in certain countries, whereby social partners participate directly to wage setting. I said it in Sweden, I said it in Denmark, I said it last week in close to near Copenhagen to the prime ministers of Sweden and Denmark, that we are, and in presence of parties and in presence also of trade union representatives, we want really to protect and we want even to promote the collective bargaining system, which is not so easy, I admit, but we want to promote it where it is too weak or very weak. So it is not our intention, because we respect national traditions and we believe in the key role played by social dialogue and collective bargaining in a social market economy. And it is not our intention because countries with a higher collective bargaining coverage tend to have a lower proportion of low-paid workers. Calling into question the collective bargaining system would defeat the purpose of our initiative on fair and better wages. The collective bargaining system must be respected, protected, and promoted. In fact, I would rather extend the collective bargaining system than calling for minimum wages. In countries having collectively agreed wages, workers are better covered and more protected. And we have a few countries in Europe where this threshold is above 70, 75, 80%. Where this is the case, well, it is very clear we should not oblige these countries to introduce some kind of statutory minimum wage. And this should be made very clear, and there should be legal guarantees to do so. Legal guarantees, not just promises from a commissioner, because commissioners go, they come and go. No, there should be legal provisions to guarantee that in those countries where the threshold is high, there should be no such obligation. So, in countries having statutory minimum wages, social partners are not consulted enough in many cases, not in all, but in some cases. And therefore, essential information is not taken on board. This may result in minimum wages changes having negative effects for workers and companies. So we want also to make sure that social partners are involved in the setting of statutory minimum wages. So we have collective bargaining, but we have also to involve, social partners in the systems where statutory minimum wages are defined. We have to invest more on capacity building on both the unions and the employer sides, and the Commission has some means to do so, but I would invite especially also the trade unions to do so, to invest a lot into helping the trade unions in those countries where they are weak or too weak to have good collective bargaining. But there is one other remark I wanted to make. It is really difficult to understand, or perhaps not so difficult, that companies who apply collective bargaining in their home country, because this is the normal system, to have collective bargaining there. Once they are out of their home country, and they are in a different setting in Europe, I do not speak out of Europe, in the European Union, then they do their utmost to avoid collective bargaining. And this is something we really have to change. I said it, by the way, to a powerful employers association yesterday, that they always say, well, let us define the wages. And I agree, if there is collective bargaining, it's the better way. But once outside their homeland, they try to avoid collective bargaining. So really we have to push also the companies to apply and to comply with the principle of collective bargaining. So I think the debate we have to have, and we have to launch in Europe, and this has already been done by ETUC, is, well, it's time for higher or better wages. And through that, certainly it's time also for better minimum wages. And this is finally our initiative. And this is also something really people in many parts in Europe are interested in. And those who have better wages, they understand that in a union, in a market where people and goods circulate freely, very low standards, social standards, very low wages are not only bad for those living in those countries with low wages, but at the end they become also bad for those with higher wages. And they will really create a pressure on these higher wages. So in order to have a better balanced Europe, socially better balance, but also economically better balance, we really have to work on this instrument of minimum wages and on an instrument also to promote collective bargaining. And therefore I hope that we can find a good agreement with everybody in the Union, also those who are more skeptical and who fear that some measure or some European directive could harm their system. I say, no, such a system would not harm you, such a directive would not harm your system. Such a directive could better protect your system. This is the issue. What can we do to protect your system? Because the attacks against the collective bargaining system could come even if we have no directive. So what we want to do is to have a directive or a legal instrument which not only pushes low wages up, but also protects and promotes the collective bargaining system. So this is what we have to do, and I think that, and I hope very firmly, that we can have a good agreement on that. I am ready to discuss hours and days and weeks on it. with the aim at the end that our family stays united, because this is a key issue. It's a key issue not only for our parties, for our family, political family, it's also a key issue for Europe, because people look at that when you talk about wages. People are interested when you talk about their personal situation. And we have to deliver on that, and we have to give them the confidence that what we promised, we will do it. Thank you.
We have indeed hours, weeks, and months. I don't think we have years, because this is for me, with my getting older, I'm getting more like it has to be known now. So I'm not getting more patience, but I think thank you very much, Nicolas, for this clear keynote. I hope you have some time for Q&A, and I saw someone in the European Parliament who knows how the system works. So Marianne Vint put her name on the list first, but I will look around, and can I take perhaps
I wait
first
till
round
after
of
the
3
panel.
questions? Are there other people who want to pose a question? Victor? And Elisabetta. So this is the first round, Marianne, Victor, and Elisabetta.
I think maybe I wait till after the panel. Maybe I get the answer.
Okay. Then Victor, newly back in the European Parliament because of Brexit. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, dear Commissioner. A very nice intervention, and of course I have to mention that also here, also in my country, in Romania, we are supporting the European minimum wage. You mentioned the 3 million people that left the country, and we also think this is one of the reasons. This is why we recently launched also a campaign raising signatures for it. We launched it 3 weeks ago with the trade unions in Romania, when we have already thousands of signatures, so people are really interested in that. So my question to you is, how do we convince the big corporations, the big companies across Europe to accept that they have to increase the salaries across Europe, and that also, let's say, in Eastern Europe, where maybe the negotiations with the trade unions is not happening fairly, that they have to do that also in our region. And of course, if you have any recommendations, please advise us on that, because you have our full support, and knowing that we just succeeded our motion of censorship against the government just now, probably we'll move away from the conservative government and come back with a left-wing government promoting the European minimum wage.
Okay, thank you. Victor, and then afterwards, Johan. Yeah, Elisabetta.
Commissaire, j'ai particulièrement apprécié la mixité de vos...
Commissioner, I really appreciated what you said, and I'll switch to English now.
Your presentation was very much touched by the relationship you mentioned between, the general structure of wages and the level of minimum wage. So if wages and the minimum wage is low, the entire structure of salaries, of course, in a way becomes low in itself. So it was very important when you said our aim as the new Commission is the one to high up to level, but towards a higher level, all the wages. I just would like to ask you if you can even better precise the way we can give legal protection to the collective bargaining system, because this is not very clear. It seems a paradox in itself, because you said in countries where the system of collective bargaining is very much institutionalized, actually we do not need a legal, a statutory minimum wage. But on the other way, we can give protection, we can receive and give a legal value to that system. But in practice, what does this mean?
Okay, thank you. I'm now giving the floor to Johan Danielson, and then looking around, I'm seeing another colleague. Perhaps for everyone who is not a colleague of mine in the European Parliament and still want to speak, please, if I give you the floor, introduce yourself. But Johan, I'm going to introduce you by saying you're an MEP from Sweden. Johan.
Well, now perhaps the question is anticipated, but I will try to surprise somewhat, and also thank you, Nicholas, for your intervention. And I have put several of the questions to you before, so I will not try to repeat myself, because of course we are one of the countries where the trade unions themselves are afraid that a directive would force us to at least make our collective agreement generally applicable. So in that sense, I could echo the question that was just raised about how these legal guarantees would be outlined more in detail. But then another question concerning the possibility to enhance collective bargaining. Because, I mean, as you said, if you just focus on the minimum wage and then also on the 60%, it will not help convergence. If you look on your own annex to your own consultation, you see that in some of the countries like Bulgaria that was mentioned, you will have a very slight increase in the wages, but in countries like Belgium, Germany, you will have a quite large increase, which will not lead to conversion, perhaps even the opposite. And also you have other countries where a large amount of workers are stuck on the minimum wage, which does not help the economy. Minimum wage should be the floor, and then people should actually be able to work on higher wages. That's the way the economy works. So in essence, if this is going to do and create all the benefits that you say, we really need the other leg to work as well, the collective bargaining, so that we get people to work on living wages, on good wages, that you have sectoral collective bargaining that works. And then the question is, more concretely, how do you foresee that the Commission can contribute also in this field of the debate, so to say? Thank you.
First Gabi and then Lina, and I saw Crystal. Gabi, MEP from Germany.
Ja, Nicholas, vielen Dank für dein Plädoyer.
Thank you, Nicholas, very much for your plea. I think there will be a good level of agreement here, which is right when we're talking about the twofold strategy you've described. I think all of us in the room will see that European policy can result in increased policy around wage bargaining and good minimum wages to shore up pay. My question is, in connection with the question you asked, how can that two-pronged strategy work better in practice? It would be good if there were some ideas around that, if you could sketch them out.
Lina.
You want to know my secrets?
Well, thank you.
Everyone
Thank you.
wants to know your secret, yes.
From the MEP from Spain. Well, thank you very much for your speech. I guess the most probably important part is we promised and we will do it. I mean, I really love it, this end of your speech. In Spain, we have been raising our minimum wage in the last 2 years, and recently in this January, we raised to 950 euros, a 31%, 5.5% increase, 31 euros, and the whole country is on fire, I will say. I mean, there are all the business organizations, especially agriculture one, and because we have a small rise in unemployment during this month, they are saying that it's obviously because of that rise in minimum wage. So this more than a question is asking to move fast as possible on that, to have all the European Union push for member states that are trying really to rise the minimum wage, but it's been very, very hard to do it because all this business organization, the media and everything is really confronting that measure that we really needed in Spain because we have a very, very low minimum wage. Thank you.
And then Crystal, and then perhaps Nicolas giving some answers. Crystal?
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Nicholas, I have no doubt about your intentions. I really believe in you that you will try to find a system where you can balance between the collective agreement countries and the others. However, I think it is interesting that you said that you wanted to create a legal guarantee even when you are not in the hot seat any longer. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that? How will you be able to foresee judges of the European Court of Justice in the future? I hope you can, but I would like to hear what your thoughts are about this. Thank you very much.
Nicolas, a long list of questions.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Just perhaps I'm starting with this issue on employment and minimum wages. There's a bunch full of literature on that. And there's no conclusion, but practice shows that there is no major negative impact on employment by introducing or increasing the minimum wage. There are also studies who show that an increase in minimum wage may have a positive impact on employment. So let us not be fooled by this theory who say, well, you want to increase minimum wage, you will produce massive unemployment. This hasn't happened. Nowhere. Even not in the US, by the way. So, on this legal guarantee, I think first I would say that the causes of these fears, which I fully understand, I understand the fears. It's not something I would just disregard. So I understand the fears. But we have to look at why this happened with Viking and all that. It's not because there was some directive saying this or that. It was the absence of any provision, social provision. Therefore, by the way, I advocate some kind of social protocol making the right balance between social and economic and free movement. That's lacking somewhere in the treaties. And the trade unions, by the way, also the Nordic trade unions have advocated and asked for that. And what I think would be possible is to have a clear-cut provision saying if you have a well-functioning collective bargaining system reaching a certain level of coverage, national coverage, to be clear, because otherwise we will be lost in details, national coverage, then this should apply as the system, and there should be no obligation to introduce whatsoever a minimum wage. Now, I think the Court of Justice is very powerful, and their power is bigger when there is no provision, when texts are not clear. Then they can, and that's their job at the end, give their interpretation. But if the texts are very clear, well, then they have also to apply the text. So I think this is a major issue. If the text is clear, when we say, well, we consider that there are two systems, or even three in some way. There's the system collective bargaining at a high level. There is the mixed system of collective bargaining and statutory minimum wage. And there is a system where collective bargaining is very low and statutory minimum wages cover more or less the rest. And we distinguish this system and we say clearly that in those countries where the level is very high, 70, 75%, that's something we can discuss, then there is clearly no obligation to introduce a statutory minimum wage, and this system should be preserved and protected. This is, by the way, what the Pillar of Social Rights says. This is more or less what the Pillar says. So I think this is very, very general terms what I have in mind, but I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal expert. I will ask all the lawyers possible to draft that in a very precise way. Now, on how can we promote collective bargaining? This is a nasty question. No, clearly, the Commission cannot dictate collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is a result in countries between rapport de force, between unions and employers. It's a tradition, but it's also a tradition which can be weakened, by the way. We have countries where this very strong tradition has been weakened, and one day the unions who always refused a minimum wage asked for one. Big country, I don't remember the name. So, what can we do? Well, first, I think we have no legal instrument to do so. Because, by the way, it's the autonomy of social partners to do that. But what we can do is, what I said, we can help by those countries where the structures, where the social partners are weak, we can, together with employers' organization, together with unions, with some European funding, help to build up this kind of social dialogue and collective negotiations. Yesterday, one big association of employers, they even made a tweet on that, say we are pleading for a higher and stronger role of social partners. Well, I take them by their words and say, help us to do so. And talk also, and that's my other argument, talk to your member companies that when they are in other countries, that they are negotiating on collective agreements and not saying, no, here we are safe, we need not have collective agreements. So this has to be something which we promote all over Europe. We cannot have a legal instrument, but we can have recommendations to the member states, because in member states it's a bit different. Governments in member states can put some pressure, can organize the system in a way where collective bargaining, collective agreements are more favorable. By the way, it was said, well, in the past there was recommendation to dissolve collective bargaining or to weaken collective bargaining, to go from sectors to enterprises, to companies. Now we should have recommendations to member states saying the contrary. We want, and by the way, it's not something which comes only from the trade unions. Even the OECD has changed totally the language on that, because now they are pleading very clearly for first collective bargaining, and second for more sectoral collective bargaining. So the idea we have to decentralize everything, it's not anymore supported even by an organization like the OECD, because there are economic reasons for saying that finally more general, more sectoral collective agreements make economically absolutely sense. My last, I think I've more or less, I have responded to my ideas. What we can do is how we promote statutory minimum wages. We need some good indicators, and there is not one only. The 60% cannot be the only indicator for statutory minimum wages, because I've said, well, then some countries say, well, fine for us because we have achieved already that. So we have to be a bit more complicated and a bit more, have a larger view when we talk about indicators. We are about to study that, and next time when I come, I give you more information on that. But it's the two-track approach, collective bargaining on one hand, statutory minimum wage on the other. Convergence, what was that? Yeah, well, minimum wages, if they are well organized, they help convergence. Obviously, convergence first they lift overall the structure of salaries, of wages, and they normally should also have to reduce the gaps. By the way, because who is suffering the most from low minimum wages? Very often women, because the majority of those who take minimum wage are women. So it's also part of that debate on gender gaps, because those who take the minimum wages are in majority women. So more or less, I think this is what you have asked me and what I can answer, let's say, like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this phase of the debate. We have now two rounds of specialists and also opportunities for Q&A, but I'd like to ask you to give a big hand of applause to Nicolas Smit for being here and being open-minded for the questions. So thank you, Nicolas. And now we're going to change the scenery here. No, he's leaving.
Are we ready? Vi klara? Are we ready? Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Because I would now like to open the first out of two panel discussions this afternoon. My name is Helen Fritzson. I'm a MIP from Sweden. I'm also Vice President in our S&D group and responsible for the European the social pillar and gender equality. I have the honor of sharing the first panel addressing minimum wage in Europe, aspiration and reality. And I really hope this afternoon will be both interesting and fruitful for all of you. And I look forward to listen to all our panelists here today. So I will introduce our distinguished guests. We have Christine Omar-Pinter, and you are working as a research manager in the Working Life Unit of Eurofond. She works in various fields of industrial relations and working conditions, focusing in particular on pay setting. I have read about minimum wages, gender pay transparency, industrial action, and social dialogue. Warmly welcome. And I also say welcome to Patrick Belzer. You are here as a senior economist, wage specialist at the International Labour Organization, ILO. And you is the coordinator of the ILO team, which provides country-level support to members on minimum wage, and also publishing the ILO Global Wage Report. I think it's a yearly report since 2008 or something. Every 2 years, yes. You are also very, very welcome this day. And welcome also to Luca Vicenti, who is the General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, ETUC. And as General Secretary, Luca is responsible for guiding and coordinating ETUC policy and addressing important issues to European workers. Warmly welcome.
Thank you.
And also our guest, Oliver Repke. You are the president of the Workers' Group of the European Economic and Social Committee, EESC. And you also have your background in the Austrian trade unions. So very welcome to us. So I hope I will now like to open the floor for our guests, and after that we are open the floor for all you and the audience. We will start to listen to you, Christine, so the floor is yours. Welcome.
So thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting workshop. According to our own Eurofound estimates, we saw that around 11% of EU workers work on or around or below the statutory minimum wages in those countries that have one. So the immediate effect of any EU minimum wage initiative would capture roughly 11%. I've been asked to start this session now with some information on what minimum wages can do and what they can't do. But the problem is it's not always so straightforward and simple. We need a third box for that. Minimum wages can set the binding wage floor, help prevent that there is a wage race to the bottom, establish a level playing field between companies, and they are very good in reducing wage inequalities, especially among the low-paid workers or the medium-paid workers. They can help give some bargaining power to the more vulnerable groups of workers, and they can also help to stimulate consumer demand, which is particularly important in times of economic downturns. But then there are other things that minimum wages can only do in combination with other policies, or they might just be doing that under certain conditions. And this is, for instance, contribute to reducing in-work poverty. They have a direct effect, but there are many other policies that need to come into this to help really prevent in-work poverty. They can also help to reduce the gender pay gap, but not on their own. Perhaps increase labor productivity, perhaps promote a bit public health. They can help to reallocate workers into more higher productive economic activities, which ultimately then stimulates economic growth. And potentially and hopefully they help to spill over to the whole wage curve and help lift up the wages of other workers that have higher wages. But that's not necessarily the case, especially when you have weak unions and when you have no collective bargaining, that also the opposite might happen. What minimum wages can't do well, they won't reach all of the workers in Europe, especially the self-employed are by definition already excluded from that, but also many of those who are in atypical forms of employment. They potentially can reduce overall employment or working hours or shift activities into undeclared work. But as the Commissioner has already mentioned, there is really a good and an important bulk of research which shows that yes, it can happen, but overall on the aggregate level we haven't seen great negative employment effects. And this is really a good news, I would argue. The European Commission has just recently, in their consultation document, started to outline which elements of adequacy they consider to be important. And that's the relationship of minimum wages to other wages as a percentage of other wages, the net value after tax and benefits, but then ultimately, is this take-home pay that workers receive sufficient for them to make a decent living? And that obviously depends on the different prices and the purchasing power in the different countries. And I cannot develop on all of these points today, but I wanted to focus on two of them, namely the sufficiency and the relationship to other wages. If you take our European Working Conditions Survey, here data from 2015, we can select those workers who are in low-paid low-earning households, but who are doing full-time work. And we can ask them, how difficult do you find it to make ends meet? And what you see here is that there is an enormous range between the countries in Europe. At the bottom of the scale, you find Sweden, where virtually no one said, among this sample said we have difficulties, whereas on the upper end of the scale we have Greece with 60% of workers in such situation reporting to have difficulties. Now, what is the role for minimum wages in that? And I tried here to plot the same data for those countries that have statutory minimum wages and plotted that against the relative minimum wages in relation to wages. So is it 40%, 50%, or 60% of the average wages, of the median wages in this case? And what you can see here is that you can't see a lot because there is no, so from this picture there is no such an immediate relationship as the Commissioner has already pointed out. So it's very important to look at the general wage level in the country and then ultimately what the minimum wage workers get as a net pay, and if that level of net pay is then sufficient for them to make a decent living. And minimum wages on their own, minimum wage policy on their own won't solve that. So how have minimum wages developed over time? The good news is that in many of the countries with relatively low levels of minimum wages, there has been a return to growth, to increases after years of stagnation, partially even reductions in real terms, and now they've started to pick up. Also very notable are the most recent increases in Spain, in Slovenia, in Greece last year, which together with the fact that in real terms in the countries with the highest minimum wages there was not such a substantial growth, together with this fact we do see some convergence since in the past 5 years. Where's the minimum wage setting going? Well, overall we see that we have really a great and a good variety of national traditions in the minimum wage setting, but with very different degrees of influence and roles for the social partners. If there has been a noticeable trend over the past 2 decades, it is that in countries with statutory minimum wages, increasingly expert commissions are being involved in the process of setting the rates, and many of these expert commissions also have foreseen a substantial role for the social partners. This is a legacy of the UK, who started with their low pay commission, but it has now been replicated in Ireland. The German Mindestlohnkommission has been put into place, and we now have Croatia and Greece joining this, and also France has included that. 2 member states, Italy and Cyprus, who don't have statutory minimum wages at the moment, are considering that, are debating it. Other member states without statutory minimum wages, Scandinavian countries, Austria, have clearly ruled this out. There is no possibility and no necessity, and this is also what we see in research. It seems to be working rather well, but we do notice that there is a knowledge gap on who are the non-covered workers and are they also the low-paid workers. So I would see some research potential for that. Now, I'm coming to my takeaway points, and takeaway points beyond the fact that it's complicated. Minimum wage policies, they will not reach all workers. It's very important to combine them with other policies like tax and benefits, employment laws, looking at what active labor market policies can do, and obviously in relation to collective bargaining policies. We know for sure that minimum wages across the board and overall have not harmed employment, but we should also not take this for granted. So I would clearly argue for monitoring any increases, any substantial increases in an evidence-informed way and in a neutral way, to see what effects will it have on working hours, on the workers who should benefit from them, and on collective bargaining ultimately. And then finally, of course, it's very important to keep social partners on board in this evidence-informed setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And then we move to our second speaker, Patrick.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today as well. And I have a presentation. I have a PowerPoint presentation as well. I don't know if it can be put on. The subject of which is the question, what is an adequate minimum wage system? And I want to give you an ILO perspective on this question based on a number of key documents that we work on in the ILO. Before starting to go into details of what is an adequate minimum wage system, however, I wanted to recall the fact that the principle of an adequate minimum wage has been reaffirmed in the ILO last year in the context of the adoption of the ILO Centenary Declaration, where it was stated that it was very important now to strengthen institutions of work through a number of different ways, including through an adequate minimum wage, either negotiated or statutory. I think we've heard already the discussion. I mean, I've heard the discussion. I can sense that there is a tension here between how the minimum wages are set. The same discussions are going on in the ILO. There are also different traditions that are being represented in ILO documents, and so the ILO considers that minimum wage can be set in either of these two different ways, statutory or negotiated way. Of course, this is the work on the minimum wage is not new in the ILO. It's been there from the start. It's in the constitution of the ILO. There is a call for the provision of an adequate living wage, and also in the very important Declaration of Philadelphia from 1944, there is a call for wage policies that ensure a just share of the fruits of progress to all. And here, I think we all agree, mostly through collective bargaining, but also a minimum living wage to all who are employed and who are in need of such protection. We have, at a more operational level, we have an ILO convention, number 131, which is really the basis on which we provide our policy advice. And we have also a minimum wage policy guide, and I have distributed here today some of the summaries of that policy guide, which go into some more details of some of the practices around minimum wage setting. I don't have a great amount of time to go into the details of ratification. Nonetheless, I wanted to share with you the fact that we're a little bit disappointed that only 10 European countries have ratified Convention 131, even though most countries would have the possibility to ratify because they have a system in place that would allow ratification. And a slightly bigger number, 15 countries from the European Union have ratified Convention number 26, but that one was adopted in the 1920s and has a slightly outdated philosophy of minimum wages. So I would invite also you maybe to consider whether ratifying the Convention 131 could be an option in your deliberations and at national level also. So what is an adequate minimum wage system? I think there are 6 key questions here. How's the minimum wage defined? Who is legally covered? Who sets the minimum wage? What's the process? What is the adequate level? how frequently is the minimum wage adjusted, and what is being done to ensure effective application, and that is an aspect that is often forgotten when we talk about minimum wages. So how is the minimum wage defined? According to the ILO, it's the minimum amount of remuneration that an employer is required to pay wage earners for work performed, which cannot be reduced by a collective agreement or an individual contract, and which has the force of law. And so this definition does cover minimum wages set through collective bargaining, as long as these collective agreements are legally binding. It doesn't mean they need to be extended, but it means they need to be legally binding, which is usually the case. But of course, you can extend the coverage through extension mechanisms. Now, what is included in the definition of the minimum wage? There is no ILO standard that addresses this issue. It's not defined in the ILO standard, but it's very important that it's being defined at the national level or the European level, I don't know, because what we see in reality is that there is a lot of confusion when the definition is not very clear. And the confusion on the side of the workers, what are they entitled to? On the side of employers, what do they need to pay? But also on the side of the courts, which is what actually is compliance. So this is very important to be very clear whether this is an hourly or monthly minimum wage. If it's monthly, it's applied to normal working time. Overtime is extra. But what about all the bonuses, the tips, the allowances? Do they count towards the minimum wage, or do they come on top of it? And we've seen that in many cases, in many countries, mostly outside of Europe, where it's not well defined, the courts are not really able to say whether there is compliance or not. Who should be covered by the minimum wage? Here our convention calls for a broad scope of application, so that especially vulnerable workers should be protected by the existing system of the minimum wage. 90% of ILO member states have a minimum wage system in place, but sometimes it only covers one sector or two sectors. The most frequently excluded groups are very vulnerable groups: domestic workers, workers in agriculture. And what about piece rate workers? We've seen also that in many countries there is confusion about whether people on piece rate are covered or not. So in your deliberation, keep this in mind as well. This is a big group. In some industries, they are very important categories of workers. How should minimum wages be set and operated? Here the key ILO principle, unsurprisingly, is full consultation with social partners, and if possible, the direct participation of the partners on the basis of equality. This can be in minimum wage commissions, this can be in more general tripartite bodies where there's economic and social consultation going on. It can even be separate. The government sometimes can consult workers and employers separately, but different modalities are possible. What we don't support is unilateral decisions by governments. Independent experts should be involved because we think that evidence and some people representing the general interest are also very important. What's an adequate minimum wage level? This is, of course, an impossible question. I'm tempted to say it's a very difficult one. At least there's maybe not one ideal level, but there is often a range of levels within which a minimum wage fulfills its main social function while also preserving the capacity to pay of enterprises. And so what we call for is a balanced approach, taking into account needs of workers and their families, and that's very important. It's not just a single worker being able to provide for herself or himself. It's needs of workers and their families, because people have dependents. That's the reality of many people. And also taking into account economic factors. How to use statistical indicators. For example, the ratio of the minimum wage to the median wage is very often used. It's a very useful indicator. We support the use of statistical indicator. As Nicola Schmidt said before, we also support the use of multiple indicators, not just one. And we support these indicators in order to inform the social dialogue on the minimum wage, rather than in a mechanical way to use in a formula which is being done in some countries and which tends to weaken the social dialogue around the minimum wage setting. We have a project also going on with supported by the government of the Netherlands, which is trying to look more into details into these methodologies to assess the needs of workers and their families, and working also with social partners and ITUC and Evelyn, who is represented here today. We do believe that the recent evidence shows that when minimum wages are set in a carefully balanced way, they do raise the wages of low-paid workers, very often women, without significant negative effects on jobs. And that's what we have written also in the Global Wage Report. We've heard that from Nicola Schmidt, we heard it from Christine as well, and this is also our view. It's very important that the minimum wage system includes a mechanism of review, an annual review every 2 years. You'd be surprised of the number of countries which set the minimum wage rate once in a while and then forget about it and then adjust it 15 years later. And this includes some large, very large countries, which maybe I don't want to name here, but which are not in Europe. And so it's very important that it's being adjusted. There are ways to adjust the minimum wage. There are ways to define criteria to support this discussion on the minimum wage, and particularly the evolution of the cost of living and some other criteria. And finally, this is my last point, it's how to promote the effective application of the minimum wage. Well, as we've heard before, including the social partners in the deliberation is a very important part of this. In addition, the minimum wage should be clearly defined. Adequate sanctions should be set up, and then proactive labor inspections, information campaigns are also very important alongside training activities. Our next Global Wage Report, a bit of publicity, will be on this subject of the minimum wage, will come out at the end of the year, and we remain at your disposal for any future exchange on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And we move over to our third speakers. Luca, you will give us the voice from the European trade unions. The word is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to attend this, that I think is a very timely and important initiative to start a discussion with the legislators about this legislative initiative that Nicola Schmidt has explained about in his speech today. We are in the middle of the social partners consultation. So this is a very formal process according to the treaties. This means that what I will tell you is not yet an official position of the ETUC. I want to make this very clear, because we are still in the middle of that discussion within the ETUC constituency, and only in a couple of weeks we will be able to reply to the first stage consultation that the Commission has launched mid-January. At the same time, I will try also as much as possible to be clear, sincere and precise in what we think this legislative initiative should look like and why. Let's start from the why, and let's very briefly analyze the situation of wages in Europe. We are just coming out from more than a decade of austerity. This austerity has significantly affected the level of wages in most European countries, and very often also has affected the functioning and the structure of the minimum wage systems, including collective agreements and collective bargaining structures. All these in many, many countries has been completely dismantled because of the semester country-specific recommendations, because of the Troika unwanted interventions on collective bargaining systems and minimum wage systems in many, many countries. And this has come on the top of 20 years of globalization, financiarization, deregulation, privatization of our public services and of our social dialogue and social market economy institutions. Why I say all that? Because the situation of wages in Europe is dramatic, is severe and dramatic, and that's the reason why we welcome the initiative that was announced by Ursula von der Leyen to intervene with some legal instrument to make sure that each and every worker in Europe can benefit from a decent living wage. if you want, this is a political statement, but it's also a very practical statement, because if we miss the opportunity to address the wage divergence and the wage tragedy that many, many workers are facing in Europe at the moment, well, we will all bear the responsibility of not having taken the right initiatives to try to address this problem. There are three types of divergence that we are facing in labor markets in Europe when it comes to wages. The first one is the divergence that is the most evident, and is the divergence between countries. It was already mentioned by many. I mean, if you take the minimum wage, but also the average wage or the median wage, in Bulgaria and in Luxembourg, the ratio is 1 to 8, 1 to 7, more or less. These are the extreme, but then if you look at the graphs, I mean, you can see that unfortunately there are many, many countries that are more close to Bulgaria than to Luxembourg at the moment. And there is no justification, neither in living costs nor in productivity levels, to back a difference like this, 1 to 7, 1 to 8. Nicolas said 1 to 3 for productivity is even less. The ratio is even less. 1 to 1.5, 1 to 2, the difference in productivity levels when it comes especially to industry sectors, if we compare Bulgaria to Luxembourg, for instance. The second level of divergence is about multinational enterprises. They were mentioned by the Bulgarian MEP, Romanian MEP just earlier. Let's take Volkswagen, the most significant multinational company, most symbolic, let's say, multinational company that we have in Europe. First example about Volkswagen. If you take a Volkswagen plant in Western Germany, before the introduction of the minimum wage in Germany, also after the introduction of the minimum wage in Germany, you will see that between a direct employee of Volkswagen in a certain plant, the one working in the supply chain of that plant of Volkswagen, and the one working in the services in Volkswagen, cleaning services, catering, etc., before the minimum wage was introduced, the ratio was 1 to 8. After the minimum wage was introduced, the ratio is 1 to 5. In the same Volkswagen plant in Western Germany. This is really a problem for European workers. Take then a Volkswagen plant in Western Germany and a Volkswagen plant in Romania. Well, the ratio for employees of Volkswagen in these two countries will escalate and will probably be in line more or less with the situation of Bulgaria compared to Luxembourg. And again, there are no justification in terms of the level of living and the level of productivity. Of course, there is a gap, but the gap is not so huge as is now in wages and in wage divergence. And there is a third element of divergence that is between traditional employees, so those that have a working contract, and those that don't have a working contract or that have a non-standard, an independent or a bogus independent working contract. For these people, of course, there is no coverage of minimum wage in most of the European countries. There is no coverage of collective agreements in most of the European countries. So this is the picture we have in front of us. And if we don't address this picture, as I said, well, we miss to take our responsibility to address the major problem that at the moment the working people are facing in our continent. And the only way to address this is to have a significant pay rise and a significant path for wage conversion towards the best in each and every European country. And it's not true, Nicolas already said that increasing minimum wages or increasing wages by collective agreements will affect employment. All the figures show that it's exactly the contrary. If you increase wages by taking into account living cost and productivity in each and every country, well, on the contrary, you are improving the competitiveness and the capacity of the economy to be resilient in the long run. So this is what we want to do. How to do it? Well, it was already said, the Bulgarian minimum wage, if we simply have a directive or a legal initiative that says we have to increase legal minimum wages in all the countries where legal minimum wages exist, well, and we set, for instance, the target of the 60% of the median, this for Bulgaria will mean that since the median wage in Bulgaria is around 3 euros per hour gross amount, and the current minimum wage is more or less 50% of this amount, to 1.5 euros gross amount per hour, increasing the minimum wage in Bulgaria up to 60% means 30 cents pay rise gross amount per hour. This is something that Bulgarian workers will consider as an insult. That's why we need to have a legislative initiative that addresses at the same time how to make minimum wages higher and better working, but at the same time also how to strengthen collective bargaining institutions, making sure that we can have a collective agreement in each and every sector, in each and every country of the European Union, covering all workers. How to do that? Here we enter into technicalities, but you know, technicalities are also very political. We think that when it comes to minimum wages, it's exactly what the ILO has just explained. These are, let's say, the targets and the elements that we need to take into account if we want to improve the minimum wage systems where they exist. 60% of the median as a target for convergence, of course gradual, because there are countries that need more time, to converge towards this. But we need to make sure that minimum wages cover all workers with no exemptions. We have to make sure that social partners participate in setting the legal minimum wages everywhere in Europe. We have to make sure that minimum wages are compulsory for public procurement. Only doing these four things, will improve significantly the minimum wage systems in many, many countries. And then we have to introduce, of course, a guarantee that there will be no imposition of a legal minimum wage to those countries where social partners don't want to have a legal minimum wage because their collective bargaining system works enough well to make sure that they can protect their workers in those countries. But at the same time, we have also to make sure that those countries like Cyprus, where there is not a minimum wage, but the social partners, or at least the trade unions, want a minimum wage to be introduced, this can be done, despite or thanks to this directive. Then we have collective bargaining, and this is the most tricky, difficult issue, of course, because many of you have asked, how can we do it? How can we really make sure that we can improve the situation of collective bargaining? From our point of view, there are three elements to be considered. The first one is that we need to remove the obstacles that in many, many countries, because of legal frameworks, wrong legal frameworks, impede the social partners to develop proper collective bargaining. For instance, introducing the possibility for independent workers to join a union and to engage in collective agreements. Second, the possibility for trade unions to enter the workplaces and to organize workers without having legal obstacles that prevent the trade unions to organize and to deliver proper collective bargaining. There are many, many obstacles that, let's say, circumvent the ILO conventions and through the national law make sure that the ILO conventions are not accessible in terms of implementation for many, many unions in many, many countries. So first, removing legal and also practical obstacles. Second element, increasing the capacity of social partners to deliver proper agreements, and this means also funding from the European Union and making sure that if the EU, through the ESF Plus, establishes a certain amount of money for each and every country to support the capacity building of social partners, there is not the Hungarian government that moves this money from the trade unions to the churches, and so destroying the capacity of trade unions to deliver collective agreements because there is no money available for them to develop their capacity to negotiate. But third, and this is the most critical but most important element, we need legal frameworks. Because, you know, in the countries where collective bargaining works and covers more than 70% of workers, there are 11 countries in this condition at the moment in Europe. Well, of course, we can help, but they are already able on their own, because they have a legal framework that supports collective bargaining, to develop better collective bargaining and better coverage. So there shouldn't be any imposition for these countries to do anything, because they are already managing on their own. I mean, it's what Nicholas Smith said. But for those that are below 70%, without introducing legal frameworks that make possible for the social partners to deliver proper collective agreements, and then for these collective agreements to be legally recognized as compulsory for workers and companies, well, this needs legal frameworks at the national level to support collective bargaining. Of course, we have a problem here. It's not exactly the imposition of a minimum wage. You know, our Swedish colleagues know that there is no directive that can really impose a legal minimum wage to Sweden. This will be against the treaties. But there could be a directive that could impose an extension erga omnes of the collective agreement to the Swedish social partners. And this is what they don't want. And they are right to be very afraid about that. So we need to find ways to help those that need an extension, because this is the only way in those countries to make sure that collective bargaining can be reinforced, by protecting at the same time the Swedes and the Danes in particular, not to have an imposition of an extension erga omnes, by solving the problem of that 10%, 12%, 15% of workers that are not covered by the collective agreements through social dialogue, through collective bargaining. There is a very interesting example that happened very recently in Denmark, and this replies also to some questions that I've listened to before. It's about truck drivers that are posted to Denmark for cabotage. So they stay in the country and they continue going around in Denmark to deliver something in the country. They come from Poland, from Lithuania, from Latvia, from Czech Republic, indifferent. So far, these people are not covered by the collective agreement. So potentially there could be a Laval or Viking case for these truck drivers. What the Danish social partners have done is that they have concluded a collective agreement that says if these truck drivers, instead of crossing the country, decide to stay in the country for cabotage, to get the permit to stay, they need to respect the wages established by the collective agreements. Without a legal extension, but the government says, I respect the collective agreement between social partners, so if a Polish truck driver comes to Denmark and stays here for cabotage, I will release the permit to this person to work only if this person will enjoy the same wage as in the collective agreement. If a thing like that was in place at the time of the Viking or Laval case, probably these cases wouldn't have happened. Because Nicola Schmidt is right. Since there is no regulation about those that are not covered by the collective agreement, and rightly speaking, our colleagues in there don't want a regulation for that, we need to find collective agreements that can really solve the problem without the rules of the single market interfering in our social partners' prerogatives. And I can tell you very clearly, colleagues, this is my personal opinion. I'm not talking about on behalf of the ETUC, because the ETUC didn't take a position yet. I'm really convinced that if we can introduce through a legislation at the European level norms like that, that encourage social partners to conclude agreements to fix the problem of the lack of coverage without having legal impositions, we will prevent any future law case on this kind of, or court case on this kind of loopholes that still exist in some very strong systems. That's why we need to explore very well the legal basis for this initiative, and we are convinced that there are very sound legal bases that can really back a good legislative initiative. We need to explore very well all details about content of the kind of legislative initiative that we need, and we need to explore together which is the best legal instrument to make sure that the content we want to achieve can be really achieved and become compulsory to protect the system that work and at the same time encourage those that are lagging behind to reach some better results. We are convinced that this is possible, but then it comes about, our responsibility to find the right solutions, and at the same time also then the responsibility of the politics, of the politicians, of the European Commission, of this European Parliament that will have really to help us in delivering something that can really improve the condition of workers all around Europe. I was kindly invited to the Congress of the PES just before the European elections. And I remember very well that Franz Timmermans, when he was, let's say, nominated as the Spitzenkandidat of the PES, in his final speech in Madrid, he said, the first legislative initiative I want to do if I become president of the Commission will be a directive to have a decent wage and strong collective bargaining for each and every worker in Europe. And the second initiative will be a directive to address the gender pay gap in Europe. Well, then this is exactly what you, the S&D group, has obtained to be included in the first 4 priorities of the first 100 days of Ursula von der Leyen. So that's why I insist again to conclude, we cannot miss this opportunity. This was a great success of all of us. So now we have to deliver on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca, and we look forward to listen to our final speaker, Oliver. The word is yours.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Helen, for inviting me to this important conference. It doesn't make it very easy to being the last speaker here on the panel, because I think we have listened to many interesting interventions and facts and figures, and I can say that almost all of this I can subscribe. And as you know, I'm here also in my capacity as a future rapporteur of a new exploratory opinion, which will be elaborated in the Economic and Social Committee on decent minimum wages across Europe. And after having listened to all the arguments, I'm not sure if we really need another opinion on this issue. But I think there are still I think there are still arguments, and I think unfortunately we even if we agree here on the importance of this initiative, unfortunately this is not shared by all stakeholders. So I think this initiative comes really timely, and also the discussion today. So thank you very much for this. Please allow me to say one word again about the social pillar, because we as trade unions, as you know, we were parts of us were quite skeptical about the idea, including myself, about the idea of another legally not binding document on social rights at European level. But I think the discussion now, and also the proposals and the announcements of Nicola Schmidt 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago about the future action plan, show that this initiative was really important, and it was the right initiative, because it serves not only as a compass, it serves somehow like a social policy agenda for us, and I hope so in next year or end of the year also as a social action program. And so I'm really happy about this, that this principles, and also the principle 6 of this social pillar, will not remain only a proclamation, but it will become a reality. Because I fully agree with Luca. We said before the elections, we said this is a really essential and social and democratic program and project that all workers should benefit from decent wages in Europe. And now we have this initiative on the table. We don't have it yet, actually, but we have at least a consultation as a first step. And I think we cannot afford that this important initiative will fail. I think this is really our responsibility. We can discuss about different instruments, about different levels where we have to implement and where we have to implement this initiative, but we should not discuss about the principle itself. I think it's our responsibility of all of us, and especially of the trade unions, to make this a reality. So this was one preliminary remark. Then I would like to maybe to tell you a bit about our project in the Economic and Social Committee, because it's true, first of all, it is the responsibility of the social partners. They are now consulted, and we will see, they have even the opportunity to enter in negotiations. So the question was, can we provide an added value as Economic and Social Committee? And to be honest, one of my principles is that we, in our opinion, will definitely not interfere with the social partner consultation. This is clear. But I think, on the other hand, this exploratory opinion, which was demanded by the European Parliament, and especially from the S&D group, and we are really grateful for this, I think this opinion can help. It can help to map the situation in different EU member states, to describe situations there, strong systems where we can learn from, but also shortcomings in other countries. And we will carry out country visits to different regions, to Nordic countries, to southern countries, to Eastern Europe, to see how can we map the situation, and how can we probably in the end also propose some possible options for action at European level. I think this is the added value we can provide as Economic and Social Committee, because, as you know, this will not be a workers' group opinion in the end. It will be an opinion of the whole committee, including the employers' group, so it will be compromised. But I think that we can really contribute to this debate. Why is this, in our opinion, and the opinion of the workers' group, the trade union group in the Economic and Social Committee, why is this a flagship project, and why is there really a need for action at European level? And I can, of course, reiterate what has been said before, but let me just mention some points. First of all, I think this is also pointed out in the consultation document of the Commission. In general, wages, not only minimum wages, but wages are too low across the European Union. Maybe not in all countries, but in many countries, they are too low. We see a lack of coverage when it comes to minimum wages, also in some countries in collective bargaining. We see that some wages itself too low. In some countries, we see that the involvement of the social partners is not sufficient. So I think there's a need for action also at a European level, because as it was said before, we had in the recent years several attacks, really attacks against collective bargaining systems, against wage setting systems. I remember the former Vice President of the European Commission, who was in favor of this decentralization of wage setting systems, and he said that collective bargaining at enterprise level can better reflect productivity levels, and I think the other way around is correct. Because if we don't have a certain centralization of collective bargaining, then we can't have an overall wage policy, which is important. So therefore, I think this was the wrong way, and therefore I'm also happy that now the Commission seems to go in the opposite direction. It was said already that in-work poverty is a big problem. 1 in 10 workers live in households that are at risk of poverty. More than 20 million workers in Europe are concerned by this. And as I said, wages have often not followed productivity trends, and this was resulting in a decrease in the wage share in the European Union. And one last figure, it was just sent out by the ETUC, because the ETUC said, and this is right, that still in 8 countries, workers earn less, in real terms, less than they did 10 years before. 10 years before, they earned more money than today. And I think this is really an alarming sign. And if you see the wage gap, especially the East-West wage gap, then it's true that we had some efforts, I think, until 2008. But since 2008, the trend is stagnating. And I like always to mention our fellow colleague, the president of the Czech Confederation of Trade Unions, Josef Středula, who said, if the trend of wage increase will continue as it did in the last years, then we have to wait another 80 years until we can reach the average of Western European wages. And even if it's 60 or 70 years, we don't have 70 years to wait. So I think this is another argument why there is a need for action also at EU level. And I think we should agree about this. And last but not least, we are not talking only about countries with too low minimum wages, with in-work poverty, and with workers who are exploited. I think also coming from a country like Austria, where we have relatively high wages and a very good functioning, very well functioning collective bargaining system, even we are very interested in higher wages in our neighbor countries, because this enormous wage gap creates a lot of problems, tensions, and it creates, of course, it causes the exploitation of the colleagues of Eastern European countries. I always mention the example in our construction sector where posted workers, especially from Eastern European countries, get in less than 50% of the cases the collectively agreed wages in Austria. So this means it is rather the rule than the exception that they suffer, that they are deprived from higher wages in our countries. And I think this is another argument why we have to work towards upward wage convergence, and we have to reduce this enormous wage gap between East and West. So if it comes to the Commission's, I don't say proposal, but initiative, then I can say that in general, of course, we also as a workers group, we welcome this proposal to strengthen wages in Europe. And I think especially, also this has been said, especially women, employees with atypical contracts and the service sector is affected, and they would benefit from such a initiative. maybe to come to an end, because we are running out of time, a last remark on the legal guarantees, because that was mentioned by Nicola Schmidt, and I know that many of our colleagues, not only from Nordic countries, of course, they remember the court rulings of the European Court of Justice, and I fully understand this. And it's not only the Nordic countries. We had recently another ruling of the European Court of Justice concerning workers, mobile workers working on trains, operating in Austria, 80% operating in Austria, but they were starting in Budapest, and the catering staff, the personnel, colleagues from Hungary, they received only the Hungarian minimum wage. And it was not an Hungarian company, it was an Austrian company. So they use these loopholes in order to exploit people, and that's their business model actually. And the problem is that in Austria this was illegal, but the European Court of Justice decided against the Austrian law. So we have to be really cautious with this. We need really reliable legal guarantees, not only announcements, because it's not enough. We can see it's not enough to have national legislation, as some countries have it, if the European Court of Justice then decides in the other way. And therefore, and that's my last word, I think also with regards to the conference on the future of Europe, we need really this social progress protocol in order to end this imbalance between economic freedoms and social rights. We have to make sure that social rights should be at least at the same level like the economic freedoms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And now we have maybe 10 minutes for questions. So, and you know, the short questions are always the best questions. I think we will start, and I will ask you if you have a question to Christine, because Christine is going to leave for going to the airport. So we start with a question to Christine. Marianne?
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your knowledge. I'm an MEP from Denmark, and as a socialist and a unionist, it's my highest priority to tackle in-work poverty in Europe. Now, after you have spoken, all of you, we know that minimum wage directive for full-time workers will struggle to cover the rising number of European workers who are engaged in non-standard forms of work. Platform workers today are defined as self-employed rather than employees. We therefore cannot regulate their wages. Moreover, they are blocked by competition policy from organizing and raising prices collectively. More and more are employed on part-time and zero-hour contract. This type of non-standard employment is in massive growth around Europe, and they are the biggest victims of in-work poverty. Christine, you said in your speech that minimum wage can't stand alone. It needs to be combined with some other policies. Can you comment on what actions the EU should take to address this complexity of working poor challenge?
Very good and difficult question. Well, legally speaking, those statutory minimum wages, they usually apply to workers in standard forms of employment with a normal working contract. They might be paid pro rata, so those that have 0 hours contracts would usually get pro rata their pay, but these hours might not be enough. Yeah? So some countries already have stepped up and made some laws which reduce the usage of the 0 hours contract. So that's one potential answer to the problem. Ireland, for instance, did that, where they made it very, very restrictive. Another option is possibly, and I understand that's also a discussion already at European level, is which status the platform workers are given. Are they self-employed or in standard employment? And the more, if there is at one point a legal clarity that certain forms of platform work should be regarded as standard forms of employment, then they would be also captured by the minimum wage policies. Then there are other examples. For instance, the ILO colleague mentioned the piece rate workers, which is rather similar also to what some kind of platform workers do. The Netherlands, for example, have just recently included the piece rate workers into their standard minimum wage policies. So that's a third option that I could think about. And to address wage, in-work poverty in general, obviously that needs to have a combination of many other policies as well, like which in-work benefits people get, extra benefits if the wages are too low, looking at the dependents, looking at what is socially needed for a worker with a family. This is what member states can do. Then obviously one big factor is the work intensity of the household. So it's a lot about bringing people into work and making sure they have the required number of hours.
Thank you, Christine, and then I give the word to Elisabetta.
I have actually a question for Mr. Visentini, if I'm allowed to. Okay? I'm going to speak in Italian, thank you. Ho molto apprezzato.
I really liked your presentation, in particular your strong policy on this policy that the political group is carrying. A directive or some legislative measure for the first time to take a broad view even of dignified work or poverty, I think is a revolution that the EU needs. There was discussion of a Europe closer to its citizens, a social or a green Europe, but you can't have that without the very powerful symbols that reach out to the daily life of ordinary people, and only a directive can do that. So I think that your confederation shares that approach. Just one point, it seems to me that you embraced a broad view of the problem. In other words, it's not just a question of a minimum wage, but giving fresh dignity to workers, and through promoting trade union rights in the workplace as well, and the freedom to unionize, and permission for unions to work, and everything that relates to dignity at work and trade unions is involved here. Also the issue of representative, which is a difficult one, and collective bargaining as well. So I think you were talking about a general, broad-based, cross-cutting directive. It may seem obvious, but I think it may be more complicated to establish.
Beta, we take two more questions and then will the panel answer. So you waved, yes, the word is yours. Please tell us who you are representing.
Hi, so my name is Linda Kunertova and I work here at the Parliamentary Research Services. Thank you all for your contributions. I mostly agree with many things that were said. I was just wondering because on the employment effects, you all agreed on the fact that there was no significant effect on the aggregate level for economies, but I was wondering whether what does the research say about the about the employment effects of at the bottom of the income distribution. Thank you.
Thank you. And then a short question from you, Mrs. Cobben.
Thank you very much. Sorry. My question's for Luca. You said that you see many different possible legal bases for the adoption of an ambitious minimum wage directive. I will be speaking on this topic later, but I was wondering whether you can already say if you agree with me that this should then not be the social policy legal basis, which I think the Commission is currently exploring, nor an internal market legal basis, because then you end up with a Viking and Laval, but that instead we should be thinking about social and economic cohesion on the basis of Article 175 TFEU.
Thank you very much. And then I give the word to you, Christine, to answer the question, and then to Luca.
Thank you. This is a very good question, and I slipped my presentation. But yes, you're right. Indeed, if you dig deeper beyond the aggregate, then you do find, and many studies find, that especially the lower skilled workers, those working in smaller companies, in the less productive companies, they might be affected. Yeah, the effects are not really great and not very big, not very large. And then the next question is, what happens to these workers? Will they be reallocated to more productive activities, to higher paying jobs, to better companies? That's what we want, ultimately, I would argue. Very well researched recently is the German case, 5 years after the introduction of the statutory minimum wage, but also the British case where they moved towards 60% of median wages now. And they have found some reductions in working hours, also across the board, but mainly for people who were working full-time and on minimum wages, so not so much for the student worker who would do a few hours. And then they also found some some effects on marginal employment, on the mini-jobbers. The number of mini-jobbers going down, which does seem negative from, if you look at it like that. But then they realized that it was because they were put into standard employment forms just to avoid any legal uncertainty. And so this is also then overall a positive effect. And it shows the importance of having this research that goes beyond the aggregate.
Thank you very much, Christine. And if you must leave, so thank you for your participating today. And then I give the word to Luca to answer the 2 questions.
Thank you. Well, first of all, directive or non-directive, this is the big, enormous question. As I said at the beginning, we didn't come yet to a clear position, official position, let's say, in the ETUC on this topic. There is a big discussion going on. By the way, we have our executive committee tomorrow with all trade union leaders to discuss in general the initiative and particularly also the legal elements in it. My personal opinion is that if we can achieve the content we want and the guarantees that we want, the directive is the only legal instrument that can allow us to enforce what we have achieved. If, on the contrary, the content of this initiative will be negative, then it's better not to have even a recommendation, because the risk then is to end up in the same kind of horrible recommendations that have been issued for 10 years on macroeconomic policies by destroying social services, I mean our welfare state and our collective bargaining system. So it's very important the kind of content we can get at the basis of this initiative and the kind of guarantees. If the content and the guarantees are sound and effective, then the only way to implement this content and these guarantees is to have a directive. I would say a framework directive, and it's not a subtle legalistic distinction, because, you know, a directive prescribes a series of criteria, adequacy, targets, etc. Here we need more targets for convergence, and then, let's say, measures to be chosen according to the different situations that exist in the various countries to implement the principles and the targets that we would like to see enshrined in this legal tool. Then, what's the best legal base for that? I'm not sure I completely agree. We are working on the working conditions legal base, because we think that this is the best legal base to achieve the objectives that we have in mind. But, okay, we are open to discuss. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the one to discuss with. So I will send you all our, let's say, team of lawyers that can, clarify the different opinions on this, in this respect, and find the best approach. We are really scared by any kind of economic governance or single market legal base, because we will be back to the horrible middle age of the last 10 years. let's see what's the best way to proceed. What is absolutely also to be avoided is to end up in a legal base that implies unanimity. This will destroy any possibility to achieve this result. Then, yes, we would like to have a legislative initiative that has a broad vision of the different elements to be considered, but not too broad. It has to be focused. Otherwise, I mean, we cannot achieve any real concrete result. That's why we insist a lot on the fact that the two elements in this legislative initiative have to be minimum wages, how to reinforce and to improve statutory minimum wages where they exist, but at the same time how to promote and strengthen collective bargaining institutions, even by creating sometimes collective bargaining institutions. And the elements that you mentioned, how to reinforce trade union rights, how to, let's say, recognize which are the most representative social partners that are entitled to sign collective agreements that can have a legal value, and also finding ways to resolve the problem of collective bargaining erosion that exists in many countries. Well, this has to be topics to be addressed. And by the way, I'm still convinced, as I said before, that the best way to resolve the problem of self-employed workers and non-standard workers is not to engage again in an endless discussion on a definition of worker that we were stuck in for all the discussion we had on the Transparent and Predictable Working Conditions Directive. The former members of the Parliament of the previous legislative term remember that. This is a dead end, I will say. It's better to concentrate on the fact that we have to guarantee to each and every worker, regardless of their working status, the possibility to join a union, to have collective agreements, and to have a decent wage and decent working and living conditions. Very, very last point, the Social Progress Protocol was mentioned. We are struggling, of course, to make sure that in the debate on the conference on the future of Europe, the Social Progress Protocol, so making sure that social rights have at least the same level of importance of economic freedoms in the European Union, will be part of the discussion. But unfortunately, we have been very disappointed by the communication of the European Commission that has scrapped the text about possible treaty changes. So my suggestion is really to this Parliament, let's do our best to include the principles that we would like to see in a social progress protocol in this directive. If we can have this here, well, we have made a lot of the work we have to deliver on.
Thank you very much, Luca. And now we have coming to the point to conclude this debate and this panel. And as you can see in the program, we have no time for my remarks or a concluding now. I think it's important that we shift to the next, also very interesting panel. So I will say very warmly thank you to the panelists in this panel. You have given us a lot of food for thoughts and also the takeaway points and a lot of interesting suggestions. So now we have to continue our common work, and I will close this, this panel and say thank you. Thank you very much. And welcome, Agnes, and your panelists.
Strasbourg, it's always
I will go to Strasbourg.
You don't go?
No, not this time.
And the week after I'm not here, and Green Week, I guess you are not here?
Yeah, I'm going to Italy. Skiing. But I can check if I am available tomorrow morning. It should be okay tomorrow morning.
You let me know. If not, we can do that.
Yeah. No, but I don't think I have. I have to check.
Okay, if everyone can have their places, we will go to the last panel of this workshop. And now we are going to talk about how to ensure decent minimum wages across Europe. So now everyone is invited to come up with solutions. And I have a very highly esteemed panel over here. I first give the floor, and not yet, but I'm going to introduce them, to Carla Wixe. She's working as an EU advisor and research officer for the Swedish trade union, LO. After also working quite a lot of time here in Brussels, representing the LO Sweden. And then later on I give the floor to Sasha Garben. She's a professor in law, EU law, at the College of Europe, on leave from the European Commission. And she will give her insights. We also have the esteemed presence of Professor Torsten Schulten, who's working at the WSI, the Wissenschaften und Sozialwissenschaftlicher Institute, from the Hans Buchler Foundation. Also warm welcome, he is a senior researcher over there. Evelyn Astor is an advisor on economic and social policies in the International Trade Union Confederation, so also in Brussels, but working with a view of all of the work. And last but not least, we have the presence here of Laszlo Andor. Here it says he is a Hungarian economist, but in my opinion, you are a former Commissioner of Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, and now working as a Secretary General of FEPS, our Progressive Research Institute. So 5 esteemed panelists, and I hope that we also before 6:30 can give some room for questions and answers and some concluding remarks. So I'm going to look to all the speakers if they are able to give their solutions in, let's say, 5 to 7 minutes. So we have room to have some room for question and answer. Carla, floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will try to keep the time. So the question of this panel is a hot topic, and I'm, as Agnes said, representing the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, LO, and a bit sad to say here maybe that we are not so happy with the proposed initiative from the Commission. And that is regardless if you ask the trade unions in Sweden or the employers or even the state level. And I will try to use some of my time here to explain why this is, because I think it's important that we understand each other even if we don't agree in the end. So we do share the same goals. Of course, the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, LO, also would like to have no inequalities and no social dumping on our internal market.
But we don't believe that maybe an initiative on minimum wages are the solution. So I will be looking forward to Professor Gabor afterwards speaking about the legal basis. We do not believe that the Article 153 is a good legal basis because we don't think that the EU have competence in this area at all, according to Article 153.5. This article protects not only their pay, which is then excluded, but also the right of association, the right to strike, which are basic components for a freedom of trade unions and also social partners. It has been mentioned as well that a possible way is the article on working conditions, but as we see it, 153.5 excludes pay from this article. So that's our main point, our first point. And then I think it's important to say also, which has been said here today, that there are very many different traditions. We have traditions with state intervention on the labor market, and we also have systems as the Swedish one with a large amount of collective self-regulation, autonomous social partners. And this is what we would like to keep, and that's also why we kind of fight so hard for these issues. I would say that our opposition in this question is not new. That's also important to say. When Sweden was supposed to enter into the European communities in '94, this was a prerequisite for us to join, that the collective agreement model and the labor market model remained untouched. That's also what we had guarantees from the Commission that that would be the case. And then we have seen the Laval and Viking case and so on, so we have had our fair share about issues in this part. So, first of all, the EU lacks competence in this area, according to the articles we just mentioned. The second point is that a directive, so a legally binding instrument, would be detrimental to the Swedish labor market system because it's based upon autonomous social partners and autonomous self-regulation in the collective agreements. In Sweden, we don't have a statutory minimum wage, but we don't have a collectively agreed minimum wage either. We don't have erga omnes extension mechanisms, and we don't, in many of the collective agreements, don't have minimum wages either. We talk about wage floors or the lowest wages in the agreements, but we don't talk about minimum wages. So that's also a difference. And regardless of this, which has been mentioned several times during today's panels, the coverage of collective agreements in Sweden is very high. On the overall labor market, there is maybe 90% if you have it like this. In the blue-collar sector, which I represent, it's over 95% of the workers covered. And this is without extension mechanisms. I just wanted to also mention shortly about what Nicola Schmidt said, because he talks about those legal guarantees, and that the European Court of Justice will interpret depending on the directive as such or the legal instrument as such. Well, even if you say something very strongly in words, the Court of Justice is still an independent judicial body as well, so they can still interpret it as they would like to. So that's a problem. We have also heard today that research and international institutions such as the OECD emphasizes the advantages of self-regulatory models such as the Swedish one. We think that a directive or a legally binding instrument would completely undermining those advantages. That's why we are so strongly against. So instead, when we look at ways forward for wages and working conditions, we think recommendations could be the way forward. So if you need to do something on a European level, we think that recommendations are the best way because it allows more for adaptation depending on the variety of the different labor markets within the EU. We have developed a non-paper, as we call it. We don't have it doesn't say that it's yellow, but if you see it over here, you can take it and it's ours, in which we have developed some of the ideas, and many of them have already been mentioned by, for example, Luca. But we see that there is need for at least 2 policy recommendations, one on wages, one on collective agreements, and also probably a third initiative more linked to public procurement and funds and so on, which could help in the way forward for a better social Europe. A recommendation on wage policy could then most likely we would like it to address the 22 member states with statutory minimum wages, which in any case already have state intervention, because EU intervention will also be state intervention, and that's the big difference. Such a recommendation can also improve transparency over wages. Social partners' influence, of course, is crucial, and also this kind of joint monitoring so we actually see what's happening in the different countries. But as Luca already mentioned, we don't think that minimum wages is the way forward in the long term. Instead, collective bargaining is the way forward, and that's also what we would like to support, of course, in the different member states. As we have heard, the possibility of organizing members, capacity building, but also protection against harassment, access to workplaces, etc., could be included in such a recommendation. And also the way to actually regulate wages and working conditions in collective agreements, because in many member states you don't have that possibility, and the recommendation could then encourage member states to actually give the social partners that kind of trust to regulate labor market issues in collective agreements. And then also has been said as well, conditions for ensuring compliance with collective agreements. So for example, labor inspections could also be part of such a recommendation. I will conclude, and I will last say also that it's important that this is not a question for us about EU, that we don't trust the EU. It's a question about the state or the EU level interfering with questions that are on the social partner kind of arena. So you will see the same opposition from the Swedish trade unions if the Swedish government tried to interfere, for example, in wage setting. So that's an important thing to say. I think I will conclude there by saying also that LO Sweden can and would like to be constructive, but we cannot accept a binding initiative such a directive. But as long as the directive is off the table, we would try to, work forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Carla already said, curious about the intervention of Sascha Carmen, so let's all be curious about your intervention.
Thanks
the floor
very
is
much.
yours.
Thank you. Yes, you should be, because law, as you will have found out already from what was said, is very important in all of this, and it's too important to leave to the lawyers, right? And I'm saying this as a lawyer, okay? So take notice of this. Why is this? Because it's a technicality, yes, but like Luca said, technicalities are extremely political. And I'll try to show you that you will have to make a choice between 4 legal options that you have that will have drastically different political and legal consequences. So there are 2 options that I didn't even include in the slides because I really think you should not consider them. And that's, first of all, the flexibility clause of Article 352, which is unanimity, so forget it. There is the second option of trying to find something in the internal market. As I said in my brief comment just before, then you will end up with a Viking and Laval, so don't even consider it, okay? So what should you then consider? Of course, the 2 other ones, Article 153, TFEU, the social policy legal basis, which I will tell you is also unsuitable. And then potentially, because I do offer a ray of hope in all of this, I'm not just here to say no, the alternative, which is not being talked about as much, but which might be very promising because it has QMV and it will not lead you into the problems of having to convince the Court of Justice that you have adopted a directive on minimum wage which actually doesn't touch on minimum wage, which you will have to do on the basis of 153, okay? And that's the legal provision on social and economic cohesion, Article 175, okay? Right, so yes, we heard about the European Pillar of Social Rights. It's absolutely great. I love it. I'm a big fan, and it has this Principle 6, and that's all very nice and well, but of course it is not
first of all, legally binding. Secondly, doesn't give any social rights that you can enforce. And thirdly, most importantly, for our purposes, it's no legal basis, right? So at the same time, forget about it. Article 153 then. Okay, so is this the Holy Grail? I know you don't carry a copy of the treaty with you, but you really should try to read Article 153 at some point and go to paragraph 5 of it. Yeah? This paragraph says, the provisions of this article shall not apply to pay. So everything that went before in that article is giving options for EU action in various ways. And then this provision says this shall not apply to pay. That means you don't have a legal basis to do anything meaningful on pay in Article 153. It's not that difficult. That's really what it says, right? Now, what makes it perhaps a little bit difficult is that you can have some measures adopted on the basis of 153, such as protection of fixed-term workers, that then touch on pay, because pay is one of the elements of their working conditions for which they have to receive equal treatment. And the court has said, okay, that is fine. But the court has said already, in unequivocal terms in that regard, that Article 1535 means that, well, at least on the basis of 153, you cannot set the establishment of the level of all or some of the constituent parts of pay and or the level of pay in the member states or the setting of a minimum guaranteed wage is excluded. It's not that difficult, yeah? So you can't use Article 153 if you want to do something meaningful on minimum wage, okay? So what can you do with 153? You could do something that terribly disappoints citizens. You could do something that says we're sort of doing something on minimum wage, but then the actual substance of the measure will avoid trying to do anything that actually does that in order to not run into problems if the measure is then attacked by Sweden or somebody else in front of the Court of Justice, right? So if you want to disappoint citizens with a false promise, yes, then you should really go for Article 153. So, okay. Now, I didn't come just as the bearer of bad news, although my natural inclination as a lawyer is to say to the politicians who like to say yes, that sometimes the answer is no. I also think there might be some scope for creativity here. And that is on the basis of social and economic cohesion. So there is a chapter on this in the treaties that starts with Article 174, and I reproduced it here. That's the kind of framework we have to look at. In order to promote its overall harmonious development, the Union shall develop and pursue actions leading to the strengthening of its economic, social, and territorial cohesion. And if I listened well to the commissioner that spoke before and many of the other contributions that were made, you can make an argument that this measure is not just about reducing inequalities within the member states, but between the member states. And it's about upward convergence, and it's about, you know, the intrinsically connected labor markets functioning better in this European context where we have free movement of economic factors and so on. I think you can make the argument. And then, indeed, you have Article 175. I'm sorry, I have to tell you about these articles because it's really important. That says, if actions prove necessary outside the funds and so on to achieve social and economic cohesion, you can adopt, well, this is, of course, slightly contestable, you can adopt specific actions, and so then you would have to see if specific actions, but I'll come to that in a moment, includes harmonizing legislation.
but by qualified majority voting, ordinary legislative procedure. So, that means you would have to do two things. Well, one thing very, very carefully especially. You would have to show that this directive really helps to reduce disparities and to contribute significantly to the harmonious development of the Union. I saw a lot of evidence already that this could be the case. That's not my area of expertise, but if you tell me that an economic case can be made for that, and if an impact assessment can produce, studies on that, I'm pretty confident that in principle the criteria for using this legal basis are fulfilled. Yes, it means you have to read this legal basis creatively and with a bit of courage. But I think there are elements in the case law that actually support this. The court has previously said that the discretion of the union legislature in using this legal basis is wise. It has already also said that this policy area includes economic and social progress. So I think you have a lot to work with. Now, this is, of course, the depressing slide that I have to include as a lawyer. I'll try to be short, but it's still very important to say. Of course, it's not a risk-free option either, right? So there is the range of uncertainties. I don't want to tire you too much with it, but there is a legal question, let me put it like this, whether the paragraph 5 in Article 153 that I mentioned before, this exclusion of pay, whether this applies to all the legal bases in the treaties or just 153. I argue, and I think I have quite a number of scholars on my side on that it only applies to Article 153 because it says that the provisions of this article shall not apply to pay. So this article, not any of the provisions in the treaty, right? So there's very strong textual support. Okay. I will leave the other things aside because I ran out of time, but if you want, we can go into this in the discussion. Just so let me conclude with these points. There is no ideal legal basis to do what we have been discussing and what we, I think, agree on should happen. But that doesn't have to be the end of the discussion. I don't think Article 153 is a viable way forward because either you do something that is going to be too ambitious and the court will strike it down on the basis of 1535, or you do something that is not ambitious enough and then you will disappoint all the citizens. So think about alternatives, think about Article 175, ask lawyers, but engage with them. Don't just leave it to them, but really try to engage with them as politicians on this. Have some courage and creativity, and also encourage the lawyers to have some courage and creativity, and then this may just happen. Thanks.
I noted down this courage and creativity. So thank you for that. And I think in the end we will conclude that we need it. But first, don't know if we're going to listen to an optimistic or a pessimistic story. I give the floor to Thorsten Schulten for his contribution.
Can I have
the clicker?
Clicker as well?
No, that's not the clicker. Is it the clicker?
Yeah, I think so, it is.
Very modern.
Just need to find my presentation. No, it's not. Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I tried to make an optimistic outlook as I think it's now 15 years ago when I wrote together with some colleagues from France and Switzerland what we call thesis, very much dubbed about that this is a good, that we really would end up with a joint definition of a European basket. I mean, even at a national level, you can discuss this for decades without finding a real solution. So in the end, I would say the KITES index is the most feasible and pragmatic criteria. And you should not forget, I mean, you should not underestimate, even if the KITES index is not the perfect indicator, it would, if you really would go to the 60%, improve wages of more than 50 million workers in Europe. And that's something, to be honest. And that's so much and so important that it would be really a shame not to use this opportunity here at the moment. And therefore, I think the KITES index should be the main indicator, but as I said, it's not perfect, it's not always working. We had the examples of Bulgaria. So what you could do is, in addition to the KITES index, to give the KITES index what you might call a reality check. And by reality check, I mean, if you calculate the 60% of the median wage level, then you really have to see at the national level, is this really sufficient? Or is it still a poverty wage because the overall wages are too low? So if you combine these two perspectives, you have the KITES index as a pragmatic solution on the basic, and then a reality check in advance, could be a system which function. And finally, of course, collective bargaining has to be strengthened in even to have adequate median wages. And here I would say I was not satisfied. I liked the speech of Niklas Schmidt, but what he said on collective bargaining, creating capacities, okay, we talk about that also for decades. It's never really had a real impact. So we have here, if we really take the idea serious of strengthening collective bargaining also from the EU level, then we have to think about much stronger instruments. And I just give you one example, which I think might be an instrument. This is the whole question of what are the criteria for public procurement, what are the criteria for social funds, for your funds. Here, I mean, in the end, it's about the idea of giving public money only to companies which are covered or which use collective agreements. That would be the basic idea. But I would advise not to put this in this directive, because then it's overdone. This is a different approach. It's a necessary approach. But my view would be say here, focus on the minimum wage, and in addition to that, make sure that you have additional, more incentives to strengthen collective bargaining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thorsten. And I saw Carla nodding quite fiercely on the public procurement.
On the end.
Oh, on the public procurement, that was. So in the end, there was something you were agreeing on, which was, I must say, quite nice. Thank you for this perspective. And now I give the floor to Evelyn Astor. Like I said, coming from also Brussels, but from the Brussels with the real international perspective. I give the floor to you, Astor. Bye.
Thanks very much. So this panel is largely focused on the what. What should a new initiative at EU level look like? But as you know, the ETUC is currently consulting its members right now on the details of that. So I would like to take a step back and look at more the why. Why is this relevant for the EU? Why is this a question for EU-level action? And we've heard a little bit before in the previous discussions talks about divergence, upward social convergence not being met. I would like to expand on that a little bit, and I'd like to back that up with some stylized facts and figures. And I would like to point your attention particularly to the Eastern European region, where we are seeing really low wages and really poor working conditions compared to the rest of Europe. And I'll say something mostly about countries in the EU, but I think it's also important for us to remember that we have a number of countries that are aspiring to have EU membership outside the EU for the moment, and how they may be affected by this as well. This is a kind of tricky graph, so I would just not like to go through and analyze all of it, but just to say this is looking at the progression of average wages for a number of Eastern European countries from 2010 to 2017. That's the latest data that we have. Looking at the EU 15, so the so-called old member states, mostly in Western Europe, Bulgaria, Croatia within the EU, and then a number of countries that are outside the EU but are aspiring for membership. What you can see on the right is essentially how the wages of these different, the average wages of these different countries factor as a percentage into the average wages of the EU 15. And I think that the image is quite shocking when you look at Bulgaria, for example, with average wages representing less than 20% of the average wages of the EU 15, Croatia around a third of the average wages, and as Luca Vicentini pointed out earlier, these differences cannot be accounted for when it comes in terms of cost of living and productivity. Yes, there are differences in cost of living, but it's not fivefold in Bulgaria. What you can also see is a general trend of wage stagnation in most, not all of these countries, but most of these countries and also within the EU 15. For governments in a number of Eastern European countries, the growth strategy has been largely to maintain low labor costs through low wages and sort of unregulated poor working conditions as a strategy to try to attract foreign direct investment, employment, competitiveness, and growth. And Eastern Europe is growing. In fact, the growth rates in some of the Eastern European member states are almost double that of the EU average. Look at Romania, for example. But this growth has been accompanied by increased levels of inequality, and also very high levels of poverty. This is a chart that's showing the rate of workers who are at risk of poverty and exclusion. According to the EU definition, earning less than 60% of the median income. And on the right, you see those workers who are severely materially deprived, so unable to afford a basic set of household items and services. And what you can see overall is that within Eastern Europe, the levels of in-work poverty tend to be higher. Croatia might look like they're doing better than the EU average when you look at the relative poverty measure, but when you look at severe material deprivation, on the other hand, they're actually doing worse than the EU average, and that's also because of the fact that wages tend to be depressed overall, a point that Nicholas Schmidt mentioned earlier. And why are workers earning poverty wages? Well, minimum wages have a lot to do with this. They're not the only reason, but what we can see is that the level of minimum wages within Eastern European countries are extremely low. And this is exacerbated by the fact that there is rather low levels of collective bargaining coverage in the region, which make it difficult for workers to actually collectively negotiate improvements to their wages and working conditions. So in this slide you see in blue the level of the minimum wage. I've expressed it in gross, even though in some countries the net take-home pay is substantially less, like in Romania. And the green bar is the average cost of living basket for a family, for an average-sized family. These are nationally specific baskets because it's very difficult to have a common methodology on cost of living, but nevertheless, what you can see, if you compare the gross level of minimum wages, let's look at Bulgaria, that's 286 euros a month, and you compare that to the estimated basic costs of a family for four, estimated at around 1,200 euros. That means that if you have two full-time earners on the minimum wage, you basically are unable to afford even half of what is needed in order to support a family. So this is obviously very problematic, but beyond just the implications in terms of poverty and deprivation, this growth strategy, this low-wage growth strategy, has led to massive levels of emigration because we have an increasingly integrated labor market. We have freedom of movement. We also have, for the Western Balkan countries, visa-free travel arrangements. And the working conditions and the wages are not sufficiently attractive to actually retain the working age population. We talked a little bit about the figures before. Around 2.5 million Romanians, that's 20% of the home country population, they currently live abroad. That's 14% of Croatians who are living abroad currently, 12.5% of Bulgarians. The EU average of workers living abroad, 3.5%. just to give you a stark image of the divergence here. And when you look at those who are outside of the EU, in terms of Western Balkans, the UNDP has estimated that around 1/3 of Balkan nationals currently live abroad. So these trends are, they're contributing to the region's dramatic demographic decline. In the long term, there's also a concern from unions, from policymakers about the sustainability of public finances here. In Croatia, if you look, for example, at migration trends combined with fertility trends, you'll see 18% fewer people living in Croatia between 2050 and 2020 this year. And if you compare 2050 to 1990, it's 42%. We're seeing already in the short term skill shortages, for example, doctors, nurses in the region. Educated young people are leaving the country to seek better opportunities, and we see even shortages in other sectors like construction workers in Romania, for example. We see a lot of construction workers from Romania here in Belgium, but actually there's a problem in terms of attracting a sufficient amount of construction workers in Romania. There are other economic consequences as well. I don't think I have time to dig into them, but low wages, the evidence is very clear around the negative effects in terms of domestic demand, the effects of low minimum wages on informality because the conditions in the formal labor market are not sufficiently attractive or sufficient to help workers get by. And I think also social cohesion cannot be understated as well. You see in Eastern Europe very, very low levels of trust in institutions according to the European Social Survey. So what do we want? I think that's really the key question of this panel. So since July of last year, the ITUC and national trade union centers in Eastern Europe, we've launched a campaign for fair wages. It's called Fair Pay in Eastern Europe, to eat, to live, and to stay. And you'll see a campaign brief printed in the front if you want more information about it. But what we're asking for, in short, is that governments should set statutory minimum wage floors that are evidence-based, that take into consideration the cost of living, that are developed with full involvement of social partners, and at the same time, they want governments to actually step up, ensure and promote collective bargaining rights to achieve fair wages above a statutory minimum level. And I should really say that within this campaign, unions do not see a conflict between asking for raised minimum wages and asking for strengthened collective bargaining. These are two complementary objectives. Statutory wage floors through minimum wages, these can serve actually as an important benchmark above which unions can negotiate fair wages above the minimum. Unions also want to see coordination between European countries on wages because they believe that if governments can jointly support and promote minimum wages and collective bargaining, we can avoid this downward competition on the basis of wages and labor costs. And we also think that this coordination is really important in order to stem the tide of massive emigration from Eastern Europe, counter this skill depletion and this demographic decline. And this is not going to be useless for Western European countries either. We've heard about stagnating wages compared to productivity. We've heard also about declining collective bargaining coverage. We know that the situation in Western Europe is not perfect, but the situation in Eastern Europe is really stark. And so that's why I focused my intervention on that. Okay. So I think I'll stop here. Just to conclude, I think that really, if we are not addressing these divergences, there is a serious threat to EU integration and the stated objective of the EU towards upward social convergence. So this is why we really want an initiative that takes wages, low wages in particular, out of competition.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And then now for the last speaker in this panel, Laszlo, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, also on behalf of FEPS. And I would like to join those who say that Nicola Schmidt should be supported in this effort. This is a very important initiative, and this support is especially important for him because on a daily basis, maybe on an hourly basis, he meets people who say that, look, you know, this might be an interesting idea, but it's not a silver bullet. The evidence base is not so obvious. The legal base is difficult. It's not an EU competence anyhow. And if all these arguments fall, there is an ultimate argument if someone comes with a good initiative in Brussels that the Germans don't want it. And now I think, exactly. So I think this is a little revolution here because, in fact, you know, it's not only a German head of the Commission who is supporting, but last year it was in the SPD program to go for this, despite the fact that in Germany itself, as Dr. Schulten was explaining, it's a relatively recent institution to have a statutory minimum wage. So from this point of view, I also see that this has been a high-speed change. A very rapid change in terms of the paradigm and the discourse. For those who are interested in the history of this, it was first time the 2012 employment package of the Commission, which proposed that all countries should have a minimum wage. It did not claim any kind of intervention from the EU side about the methodology, but just put forward this idea that all countries, perhaps even Germany, should have one, and then this took place about 18 months before the Social Democrats joined the Grand Coalition, and this, I think, is very important for those who say that nothing good came out of the Grand Coalition or the ministership of Andrea Nahles, because this is something very, very concrete, and I think the German minimum wage has had, first of all, a success, but secondly, a European importance, because it helped shifting the paradigm on wages and wage setting. It did tackle a large amount of in-work poverty in Germany and shows an example and creates the appetite to do something similar at the EU level, because Germany can be an obstacle if it wants to be for good initiatives, but I think it's very good that if something works well, they want to export it. And there are many reasons for exporting it. I think the European Pillar of Social Rights created a narrative in which this institution can be brought to the European level, and many good arguments were also put forward 2 years ago in the trade union campaign when they spoke about Europe needing and deserving a wage increase. And again, for the historians, there was a very interesting approach put forward suggesting that there should be a kind of target in terms of by which year the wage levels should reach the 60% of the median wage in each and every country. That's what the trade unions put forward 2 years ago. Very interesting concept, but with targets, what very often happens is that you agree on a target, and every morning when you wake up, you pray that the target should be reached somehow. And of course, this is not the most convincing enforcement mechanism in Europe or elsewhere. Now, so appreciating that the narrative has changed so quickly, I mean, in historical terms, this is a very, very quick process. What I would like to argue is that despite all the skepticism which may come from various places, including Nordic trade unions, what we speak about today is a silver bullet. Not in the sense that it would solve all the problems, but it contributes to the solution of many problems. And I would just like to highlight 5. Almost all of them have been mentioned in the discussion, but for the sake of summary, I think this should be useful. The Commissioner also started with the emphasis on in-work poverty. Very few people, apart from me, remember that 10 years ago, a Europe 2020 strategy was launched. And one of the headline targets of the Europe 2020 strategy, which was at that time considered to be a modest target, to lift at least 20 million people out of poverty or social exclusion. Now, in 2020, some, maybe in the Eurostat, because the Eurostat still follows this, they will find out that the actual achievement is much less than 20. So the European Union, the member states, because it has been primarily their competence, only managed something which is much weaker than a modest ambition set out in 2010 in this field. And it's paradoxical because there have been a lot of talk today about Romania and other East European countries, but interestingly, it came actually from Romania and Poland, where thanks to the reduction of material deprivation, the biggest progress has been made in terms of the reduction of poverty or social exclusion. But what concerns relative poverty, income inequality, there is no progress in Europe in general. And what is primarily responsible for this is in-work poverty. This is very, very important. Working age poverty. Now, the support from the side of the minimum wage setting, if it's decisive, if it's not a cosmetic approach, if it's not a kind of wish preached in the European semester, of course it can help. Now, the second point is the single market. When we discuss the East-West imbalance, in my view, we have to be more explicit that this is an issue of the single market. And it's about the cohesion in the single market, because without convergence, and especially with divergence, the cohesion of the single market weakens or even falls. And what we are witnessing is that, through higher than average GDP growth, the Eastern countries are converging in terms of GDP, because everybody knows that the Polish, Romanian, and other GDP growth is about twice as high as the Eurozone. It's not that hard. But there is no social convergence coupled to this. So there have been, at least 10 years ago, a massive decoupling between economic convergence and social one. Why? Because of the industrial relations, because of the welfare states are much, much weaker. And it's not only that they are weaker by accident, but this is, by the way, on the right side, the fresh, just a few days old Eurostat map, which shows that minimum wages are much paler in the East than in the West. But what I want to jump to is this, that the minimum wages in the Eastern countries are lagging behind because it has been a policy to compete by lower costs, including lower wage costs. So what we speak about is a growth model of the Eastern countries where unions are weaker by design, social dialogue is weaker by design. So if providing assistance to countries to strengthen it, if they don't want to strengthen it, because they believe that this is what makes them competitive against your countries, 1, 2, 3. Exactly. So then we have to have a different approach. And indeed, we can speak about the lack of sustainability of this model, which maintains about a 15 percentage point gap between the wage share in manufacturing between the European average and the Visegrad countries. We have to speak about the lack of sustainability of this model, partly for economic reasons, the so-called middle-income trap, but also because of the demographic decline, which was just pointed out by several speakers before me. The third point where the silver bullet would function is the EMU. Luca and others referred to this, that there were the dark Middle Ages when the Commission was advocating the reduction of the minimum wage, and luckily we are not in a crisis. But what I would like to stress is that in the absence of some new tool which protects the minimum wages, in the next crisis there will be too many people around, including in the Commission, who learned nothing and forgot nothing. And then they will come again with the push to hold back wages or reduce the minimum wage in country X or country B, because there is no other firm instrument against that kind of attitude. The case of Greece, of course, should be studied for, by those who want to look into that, and also the ridiculous argument that were put forward at that time. The number 4 is the overall wage share of the European Union. This has also been mentioned, but this is also something where, in fact, the European governance is just set in a way that surplus countries, Germany and the Netherlands, just hold back wage increases and maintain these extraordinary surpluses on the current account, which creates the great imbalances. More dynamic wage growth could help, but they cannot produce it. They cannot produce it, and they cannot tackle the imbalances in the monetary union, and instead of that is the countries of the periphery, or namely the south, which are pushed into a deflationary cycle. So a stronger push would also help in this respect. And the final one is the gender pay gap, where I think it was exactly Nicola Schmidt who elaborated on this very, very clearly. There are a lot more women working at or close to minimum wage, retail sector, health sector, and you name it, where this really makes a great difference. I heard today the Commissioner Dalli, speaking about the intentions to work on transparency, but working on transparency is insufficient if you want to close the gender pay gap in a meaningful way. And besides these 5 points, of course, there are many other anomalies where a European action could help. For example, the Hungarian case, where yes, there has been some dynamics to improve the minimum wage, but it doesn't apply to those who participate in the public work schemes. And that can be hundreds of thousands, not small numbers. So it's practically cheating what has been around, or other cases where some groups are excluded on the ground of age. If you are too young, you don't get the minimum wage, and I think a European framework should also help in this field. So, yes, I know there is skepticism. I think I heard Sasha several times, and of course I respect your views, and that should be the one for others also to consider at least. But everyone who says, okay, the EU should not interfere in wages and wage setting, look, what happened with the Posted Workers Directive? Because it has been helping the high-income countries, the EU did intervene in wages and wage setting. Because in 1996, when Sweden was already in the European Union, they declared that the receiving countries' minimum wage should apply, and more recently, the actual remuneration was equalized. So if an EU tool helps you, you like it. If an EU tool would help someone else, you don't necessarily like it. And it's a kind of general skepticism about social Europe, while enthusiasm to TTIP and other things makes a very interesting profile of the Swedish unions, which we otherwise admire, because everybody would love to be Sweden, but we need a bit of an assistance for that. Whether this would put Europe on a slippery slope, because that's also a kind of argument that, oh, you open this door and then you don't know what else comes. Look, I think that door has to be opened, and the minimum wage coordination should be followed with unemployment reinsurance, should be followed with perhaps something on pension, perhaps something on minimum standards in healthcare, because there are so many fields where we are lagging behind. And if we want to reinforce social Europe and the European Union in general, gain confidence from the citizens in the EU project, then these steps have to be made. Thank you very much.
Okay. The time says we have only 4 minutes to round up this debate. just in the meantime, I say there are a lot of people participating in this debate via the web stream. So if anyone wants to contribute later from the public via the web stream, please send us an email to the S&D addresses. We'll be more than welcome. I saw one request for the floor for someone who is also wanting to show that everyone wants to be a my Swedish colleague, Johan.
Thank you. I think on the remark on the posting directive of 96, I think we agreed to disagree, and then we move back to the debate on the eventual current proposal on an European minimum wage. Because I think throughout the discussion today, I mean, we can all agree on the problem that are described. But then I think the question is, what can we reasonably expect that the upcoming initiative will solve? We hear about, I didn't catch the Romanian numbers precisely, but perhaps 20% of Romanians lives outside the country. But this is one of the countries that already has a minimum wage close to or at 60% of the median income. And the increases of the minimum wage in Romania has recently, not in the dark ages, been called upon by the Commission that they are too fast. Huh? So we are quite close to the dark ages still, even if nuclear Schmidt might be a light in the dark. Huh? But I think we need to keep this in mind as well. So then 3 quick questions, hopefully quick. Firstly, on the legal base, because of course I agree with the interpretation of Article 153 and the limitations that 1535 gives on using the working condition as the legal base. And at least this will have to limit the scope of any initiative. But still, this is clearly the legal base indicated by the Commission in the first state consultation. It was also the legal base indicated by Luca Vicentini from the ETUC. And this perhaps lead me to a similar assumption that we might expect a limited proposal that will not solve the problem, but will still risk to undermine functioning models. And then the risk and the possible benefits, I think, is something that needs to be considered. And then, secondly, I have a question perhaps also to Laszlo Andor and others about why don't we try to go for an initiative on minimum income? I would say that we have, with concerns to the legal base, a broader scope in the treaties, and it might lead to the same effect in the long run. It will at least affect the wage at which people take up work. And then, thirdly, perhaps a more philosophical question, but I think sometimes it's relevant, and it concerns the distribution of powers between member states, regional, local level, and the European level. If there is a problem correctly identified, is there always a European solution? Thank you.
Okay, but I'm afraid this last question will take a completely new workshop. And I think everyone following us on web streamer is then left the building. But perhaps we also have left the building. But it's a good...
The interpreters have been instructed to stop interpreting now, as this is the end of the normal interpreting time.
From the General Workers' Union in Spain, UGT, and for the sake of the linguistic plurality that was appealed before, I will speak in Spanish if you don't mind. So, la primera cuestión es agradecer todos los aportes que se han hecho desde aquí, y sí me hubiera gustado, esto lo digo a la organización, que casi la única visión de una organización sindical nacional.
Sorry, the interpreters have been instructed to stop, as this is the end of the scheduled working time.
There's a problem with the translation.
That's fine.
Oh, the translation has finished because we are over time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
You should have asked for the floor earlier. Excuse me.
Yeah. No, but I would have liked, because the only national trade union that has been represented on the table, it was somebody that was not in favor, our colleagues from LO. I would have liked to see any other confederation from the south or from the east that could have maybe had a different point of view. In my case, coming from Spain, I can say that I don't think that we are right when we are talking about the Swedish model, because this was the model also in my country, where we once, and it was just 10 years ago, we had 81% of collective bargaining coverage, and right now, due to the recommendations of the European Commission, that by the way have sanctions, and you have to remember it has sanctions, so it's not just a simple recommendation as we are talking here, let's go for recommendations. No, I want the same kind of recommendations. We have gone from 81% to less than 64%, and that was the Spanish model as well, and it was the model of Germany, and it was the model of Greece, and it was the model of so many countries all over Europe. For me, it's very difficult to talk about when we are talking about a constructive, that we want to be constructive, but we are saying that either it's our model or it's no other model. And if we are crossing this line, we are not into being constructive. And we have said very clear that it has been said here before that in Spain we have achieved. By the way, it was said that the employers are on fire. They are not on fire. They signed the agreement, and this was due to socialist prime minister, by the way, Pedro Sánchez. So you have to put into value as well what socialist governments can do. They can sit employers and trade union representatives and go for a measurement that has been largely applauded in the whole country, but probably in the whole Europe. Because, and this is my conclusion, sorry for the time, this is my conclusion, it's very difficult for me to be seated here in the European Parliament, the most democratic institution of the European Union, talking about wages like if it was something that was coming from the river. And we are among politicians, and politicians have to take the initiatives. And if the treaties do not allow to do something, politicians are here to change the treaties as well. And maybe this is something you should all consider, and not just be focused on Article, 150 something, 70 something, but maybe we can change and we should change the treaties and the policies. Because the result in many countries of the big increasing in vote that socialists have had are due to this promise. And it's very, very, very weird if they cannot honor the promise, or they will end up again where we know that we can end up. Thanks.
Thank you for putting some extra ambition in the last part of the debate. Can I go just a quick round? People want to respond, but really quick, because I think in 10 minutes' time we should leave the building. Carla, do you want to respond? Or do you, so if you say, I said what I had to say, also okay, but...
I just say some words very short, like these legal guarantees that we talk about, we don't see how they are legally going to work. So that's also important to say. And then just a question on coverage, because we have also heard about the erga omnes, the extensions. And our legal analysis says that if there is a directive, in any case, a directive will be binding to all member states. And the idea of a directive is also to kind of embrace everyone. And that's the problem for us, because in our system we know that there are a lack. Everybody is not covered by collective agreements, but that's a very, very small amount. And the idea that in Germany, we respect, of course, that you have changed your system, but that was a change that came from within. It was the social partners who decide that on their own. And maybe in 50 years we will decide the same, but we will not that the EU shall decide that for us. So okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Position clear. Sasha.
Yes. Legally, you can have a very convincing derogation in a directive. You can do that. And I will tell you when you can and cannot do things, honestly. I agree with what you were saying. This is the problem, I think, with the current approach. If it goes down the road that has been set out in the consultation, I fear it will be a middle-of-the-road initiative that will disappoint everyone and might do more damage than good. So I would say, perhaps in response to this consultation, the people in this room should try to push for the alternative, because I'm not sure if you understood me correctly. I'm saying that actually, surprisingly, the treaty may give you the competence, but on, indeed, another legal basis. If you want to change the treaty and create the perfect legal basis to do this, then, of course, that's even better.
Okay. No last contributions anymore? I think it was indeed a last, a very nice last remark. If we can change, if we need to change the world, we have to change the world. I'm also quite convinced that we can change the world if we work together. So this is why it's important to listen to the concerns of everyone and see if we can come up with a common and balanced solution, but also a solution which gives us the pushing power to push for change, because not only did everyone agree on the public procurement as a part of the solution, but I think the change in the debate. You mentioned the fact that social issues are on the agenda. That didn't happen out of nothing. We pushed for this, and now it also gives us, I think, and I hope, the courage and the creativity to work out a silver bullet for the problems concluded. So thank you very much for those people who stayed until the end. A lot of food for thought, so thank you for the panelists for this. This is not the last debate on this topic, and thank you for everyone who enriched this debate. Thank you.